She found the receipt on a Tuesday, not during an argument, not because she was suspicious. She found it the way most lives crack open by accident while doing something ordinary. She was hanging Do-jun's jacket when the folded paper slipped from the inner pocket and landed face up on the closet floor. Executive Suite 1407, Imperial Grand Hotel. The date printed at the top matched the night of its father's memorial, the night Han Do-jun had looked her in the eye and said he needed to stay at his mother's house, that grief-required family, that she should rest at home alone. Aaliyah stood there, holding the receipt for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she put it back exactly where she found it, smoothed the jacket, closed the closet, and went to finish cooking his dinner. A sound like green wood splitting. If you've ever swallowed something that should have made you scream, if you've ever smiled at someone while your whole world was collapsing behind your eyes, then you already know where this story goes. Stay with me, because the woman you're about to meet is someone you will not forget. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Aaliyah Monroe had been practicing the art of disappearing for 5 years. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind where a woman packs a bag in the middle of the night and walks out into rain. The kind she had perfected was quieter and more corrosive. The daily, incremental erasure of preferences, habits, and small personal truths that accumulate into an identity. She had stopped ordering spicy food at restaurants because Do-jun found it unsophisticated. She had stopped laughing too loudly because his mother found it unbecoming. She had stopped correcting people's English in polite company because his associates found it embarrassing. 5 years of those micro-surrenders, stacked one on top of another, had produced the woman standing in that Busan penthouse kitchen at 6:40 in the evening, composed, presentable, and almost entirely erased. She was 32 years old. She had a master's degree she had never used. She spoke 4 languages, including Korean, which the Han family universally assumed she understood only at the level of a child who had memorized useful phrases. That last part had been the most useful mistake anyone ever made about her. Kitchen smelled of doenjang jjigae, Do-jun's mother's recipe, which Aaliyah had spent 3 months learning to replicate, precisely because Kyung-suk had once commented, in Korean, to another woman at a dinner party, that Aaliyah's cooking was the culinary equivalent of a tourist trying to understand a country from an airport. Aaliyah had understood every word. She had smiled and refilled the woman's tea. Now she stirred the pot and thought about Suite 1407. The receipt had been detailed. She had read it in the 11 seconds she allowed herself before putting it back. The checkout time. The room service charges 2 glasses of wine, 1 pot of chrysanthemum tea. Choi Hai-rin drank chrysanthemum tea. Aaliyah knew this because she had spent 2 years memorizing the preferences of every person orbiting her husband's world, cataloging them the way a diplomat catalogs intelligence, systematically, patiently, and without letting anyone notice she was doing it. Hai-rin was 28, the only daughter of Choi Byung-won, who ran the Daegu-based Baeko faction with a particular kind of cruelty that other crime families described as efficient. She was educated in Paris. She wore her hair in the same severe center part, regardless of the occasion. She had shaken Aaliyah's hand at 3 separate business dinners and looked through her each time, the way people look through furniture. Aaliyah set the table for 2. She folded the napkins the way Do-jun preferred the trifold with the point facing left. She lit the candles at the correct distance from the centerpiece. She was halfway through pouring the barley tea when she heard his key in the lock, and something in her chest performed the familiar involuntary compression that had come to replace whatever warmth she'd once felt when he came home. Han Do-jun entered the apartment the way he entered every room, as though the space had been expecting him and was slightly relieved by his arrival. He was 40 years old, which had not softened him the way it softened some men, but instead had refined him into something more concentrated and harder to read. He had the kind of face that people described as handsome before correcting themselves and saying striking. Because handsome implied something accessible, and Do-jun had never in his adult life been accidentally accessible. He ran the Chongyang Syndicate from an office overlooking Busan Harbor, and he ran it with the kind of precise, contained authority that made people both respect and fear him simultaneously, which was exactly how he preferred it. "You cooked," he said, dropping his keys on the entryway table. "Your mother's recipe." Aaliyah handed him the barley tea. "You look tired." He accepted the glass without looking at her face, which was something she had started counting several months ago without quite understanding why. The number of times per evening he failed to make eye contact with her. It ran between 4 and 7 on most nights. She had stopped trying to determine whether this was intentional. The Incheon negotiation ran long. Did it resolve? Mostly. He loosened his tie, sat down, and reached for his phone. Yoon Suk is pushing for a longer transition window. He thinks 18 months is aggressive. "It probably is," Aaliyah said, sitting across from him. "His family controls 3 of the distribution channels you're trying to absorb. If he feels cornered, he'll stall, and if he stalls long enough, his cousins will find another buyer." Do-jun looked up from his phone. That look, the brief recalibration when she said something that demonstrated she had been paying attention, was one of the things she had once found compelling about him. The way he could be surprised by her and cover it instantly. Early in their marriage, it had felt like a form of intimacy. She had believed she was being seen. Now she understood it differently. He was surprised every time, because he had fundamentally never expected her to be paying attention. The surprise was not admiration. It was recalibration. She was a variable he occasionally forgot to account for. "Yoon Suk responds to gestures," she continued, ladling the jjigae into his bowl first, because that was protocol. "If you offered him an advisory role on the transition board ceremonial, no real authority. He'd feel honored enough to accept your timeline." Jun was quiet for 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to run the internal filtration system he used to evaluate intelligence before deciding whether to use it. "That might work," he said. "It'll work," Aaliyah said. She ate. He ate. The candles burned down 2 centimeters. The evening unreeled with the practiced smoothness of a marriage that had long since replaced genuine communication with efficient routine. He did not mention his mother. He did not mention Hai-rin. He did not mention Suite 1407 or the Imperial Grand Hotel or Chrysanthemum Tea. Aaliyah did not expect him to. She watched him eat the food she had cooked from his dead father's wife's recipe and understood with a clarity that had been building for months, but finally crystallized in the closet that afternoon, that this marriage had never been a partnership. It had been an arrangement in which she provided services and he provided proximity to safety. She had confused the two for love for a very long time. After dinner, she cleared the table while Do-jun took a call in his office. She could hear his voice through the closed door, low, controlled, the precise cadence he used with subordinates when he wanted to convey that a particular conversation was over. She washed the bowls by hand because she preferred it, because the feel of warm water and her own hands moving was one of the small private pleasures that still belonged entirely to her. She was drying the second bowl when she heard him say Hai-rin's name through the door. She dried the bowl completely, set it down carefully, picked up the third. The call lasted 6 minutes. When he came out, his expression had shifted in the specific way it shifted when something had been settled. "I'm going to bed early," he said. "The Incheon situation needs resolution before Thursday." "Course," Aaliyah said. "I'll be in shortly." He went into the bedroom. She stood in the kitchen for another 4 minutes, the dish towel folded over her arm, looking at the city through the window. Busan at night was a specific kind of beautiful layered, industrial, built on hills that should have been impractical and weren't. Lights stacked up the mountainside like something accidental that became intentional over time. She had tried to love this city. In the first year, she had walked its neighborhoods carefully and deliberately, learning it the way she had once learned languages, phoneme by phoneme, rule by rule, until the structure became instinctual. She had learned which streets flooded in heavy rain, Which market vendors gave better prices to familiar faces? Which subway lines ran late on weekends? She had loved the raw, salt-heavy air off the harbor and the way the fishermen at Jigalchi moved with the particular unhurried confidence of people who had been doing the same thing for 40 years and intended to do it for 40 more. She had tried. That was the part that mattered. She had genuinely tried. She put the dish towel on the counter and went to the second bedroom, the one she used as a reading room, and sat in the chair by the window. Her phone was on the side table. She picked it up and opened her contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't called. In 2 years, Danielle Mercer. They had met during a semester abroad program. At 18, two young women from different worlds who had recognized in each other the particular brand of ambition that doesn't announce itself. Danielle was now a corporate attorney in Singapore. She worked with international firms, handled cross-border disputes, dealt regularly with the specific complications that arose when powerful people's private lives intersected with their professional obligations. Aaliyah stared at Danielle's name for a long time. Then she put the phone down without calling. Not yet. She needed to think first. She needed to be precise about what she was about to do, because precision was the only leverage available to a woman in her position. Do-jun controlled resources, personnel, information networks, and relationships spanning 4 countries. His mother had the particular of a woman who had spent 4 decades learning how power worked in their world and had never made the mistake of underestimating it. If Aaliyah moved wrong, if she was too fast, too visible, too obviously purposeful, she would be managed. Not threatened, not confronted. Managed. The way inconvenient things were quietly absorbed and redirected in their world. She could not afford to be inconvenient. She had to become invisible in a different way. She went back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea chamomile, not chrysanthemum, and stood at the counter reviewing the evening's dinner conversation with the detached attention she had once applied to thesis research. Do-jun had mentioned Yoon-suk. He had mentioned the Inshin transition timeline. He had, without realizing it, confirmed that the absorption of Yoon-suk's 3 distribution channels was entering its final negotiation phase, which meant certain financial instruments would be moving within the next 90 days. Aaliyah knew where the documents were. She had known for 2 years. Do-jun's private study was organized with the confidence of a man who had never seriously considered that his wife might be reading his files. The combination safe behind the framed calligraphy piece was 8 digits, his father's birthday, in reverse. A sound like green. She had determined this 14 months ago by watching the way his right hand moved when he thought she was in the kitchen. The filing cabinet used a standard key that lived in the center drawer of his desk. She had noted the key 7 months ago and had never needed to touch it because she had already understood that the time to need it would eventually come. She finished the chamomile tea, rinsed the cup, dried it, set it back in its exact position, went to bed. Do-jun's breathing was already the slow, indifferent rhythm of deep sleep. She lay beside him in the dark, looking at the ceiling, and ran through the practical mathematics of her situation with the systematic calm she had cultivated over 4 years of surviving inside a world that required her to function while feeling almost nothing. She had approximately $42,000 in her own name in an account he didn't know existed, accumulated from the household budget she managed by being 30% more efficient than he expected. She had her American wood splitting. She had her American passport current. She had a standing graduate school application she had submitted 18 months ago to a program in Seoul and never mentioned. They had offered her conditional admission, and she had deferred twice. She was not starting from nothing. She was starting from a position she had been quietly, invisibly constructing for a year and a half, the way a woman builds a second life, while appearing to be fully occupied with her first. The night passed. At some point she slept. In the morning, Do-jun was gone before she woke, which was normal. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and called Danielle Mercer at 7:45. Danielle picked up on the second ring, Aaliyah. There was the particular texture in her voice of someone who had been expecting a call without knowing when it would come. "Talk to me. I need a recommendation," Aaliyah said. "A divorce attorney." Someone experienced with complicated financial situations. Someone who won't be intimidated by a client's husband's reputation. There was a brief silence. How complicated? Danielle asked. Aaliyah looked out the window at Busan in the morning light. The city already moving, already building toward noon. Very, she said. Danielle was quiet for 4 seconds. I know someone, Vivian Lau, she's in Seoul. She handled the Kwan dissolution 2 years ago. The family was triad adjacent. It was genuinely messy, and Vivian got her client out with full asset partition and zero personal risk. Can you make an introduction today? Give me 2 hours. Thank you, Aaliyah said. Don't thank me yet, Danielle said. Thank me when you're out. Aaliyah set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at her hands. They were steady. She had expected them to be shaking, and they weren't, which told her something she had suspected for a while. The emotional work of this marriage had been completed long before this moment. She was not deciding to leave. She had already left. She was now simply arranging the logistics. That distinction mattered. Vivian Lau called at 10:12. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent 20 years operating in rooms where being underestimated was a professional hazard and had consequently removed all softness from her presentation without becoming cold. She was precise. She asked questions with the targeted efficiency of someone who had learned that the most important information in a complicated divorce was always the thing the client hadn't thought to mention yet. Tell me about the assets, Aaliyah told her. Property holdings across Korea, 2 in Japan. Corporate accounts through 3 legitimate subsidiaries. The real estate fund that existed on paper in Singapore, but was capitalized through the Chongryong Syndicate's legitimate revenue stream. The joint accounts, the investment portfolios. What about documents? Vivian asked. I have access. A beat. What kind of access? The kind that involves a filing cabinet and a combination safe, Aaliyah said. Another beat, longer this time. Don't touch anything yet, Vivian said. Don't photograph, don't move, don't copy. Do you understand me? Not one document until I tell you to. Because if you pull documents now and he notices they've been disturbed, we lose the element of surprise, and surprise is the only structural advantage you have over someone with his resources. I understand. The second rule, Vivian said, is that you do nothing that looks like preparation. Nothing that reads as strategic. You need to continue existing inside that marriage as though you intend to remain in it indefinitely. Can you do that? Aaliyah thought about 11 seconds standing in the closet. About cooking dinner. About the candles at the correct distance from the centerpiece. Yes, she said. I've been doing that for 5 years. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something in her tone had changed slightly. Not softer, but more precise. Then here is the third rule. The only rule that matters. Do nothing until you are ready to disappear completely. Not mostly ready. Not nearly ready. Completely ready apartment, accounts, documents, travel arrangements, everything in place. Because the moment he realizes what you're doing, the window closes. And a man like your husband does not give second windows. Aaliyah looked at the kitchen table, at the cup she had rinsed and dried and set back in its exact position. How long, she asked. 4 to 6 months if you're disciplined, Vivian said. Possibly faster if an opportunity creates itself. And if an opportunity creates itself, then you're ready when it does, Vivian said. That's the whole plan. Being ready. Aaliyah thanked her and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table for 17 minutes, not moving, working through the shape of the several months with the methodical precision of someone laying out a construction project, phase by phase. She identified 9 discrete tasks that needed to happen, assigned each a rough timeline, and noted 3 that required external help, and 6 she could accomplish entirely alone. Then she stood up, washed her cup, and went to her reading room to work on the Korean vocabulary she was still, theoretically, struggling to master. 2 floors below, in the building's basement parking structure, Do-jun's second car sat beside the space she never used. She had never learned to drive in Korea, or so everyone believed. She had gotten her Korean driver's license 11 months ago under her maiden name, at a testing center in a part of Busan she had no professional reason to visit. The man who had taught her to parallel park in a borrowed vehicle had assumed she was newly divorced. She had not corrected him. Outside the window of her reading room, Busan moved through its ordinary Tuesday, unaware that inside one specific high-floor penthouse, a woman was finishing the quiet, careful construction of the rest of her life. She opened her Korean vocabulary workbook. She turned to a page she had already memorized completely. She began writing out words in careful, deliberately imperfect characters. The small mistakes of someone still learning, still trying, still exactly where everyone expected her to be. The vocabulary workbook stayed open on her desk for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Aaliyah Monroe attended 2 syndicate business dinners, arranged flowers for a partner's wife recovering from surgery, remembered the name of a lieutenant's youngest daughter when nobody else at the table did, and translated a legal summary from English into Korean for Do-jun's head of operations, deliberately introducing 2 subtle errors that made the document read as though she had worked very hard on it. Nobody questioned the errors. Nobody questioned her. That was the architecture she had been building for 5 years, and now she was living inside it like a blueprint she finally understood how to use. Vivian Lau called every Tuesday at 10. The calls lasted between 8 and 14 minutes and were routed through an application Danielle had installed on Aaliyah's secondary phone device, purchased with cash from an electronics vendor in Seomyeon Market, registered to an email account that didn't connect to her name. Vivian did not waste words. She asked questions, Aaliyah answered, and together they moved through the checklist with the unhurried precision of people who knew that rushing was the specific mechanism by which these situations collapsed. The apartment came first. Vivian's instruction had been explicit. Nothing in Aaliyah's name, nothing connected to any address Do-jun's organization could reach through routine surveillance. Aaliyah had spent 6 days identifying the right neighborhood, not too far from the university district she was planning to claim as her cover, not so close to the harbor that syndicate contacts might recognize her. She settled on a street in Sasang district, the kind of block where nobody was surprised to see a woman moving boxes alone on a Saturday afternoon, because the building was old enough that turnover was constant and attention was scarce. She viewed the apartment on a Wednesday when Do-jun was in Seoul. Took the subway, not a taxi. Wore a dark coat she had purchased specifically because it was unremarkable. The landlord was a retired civil servant named Mr. O, who wanted 3 months' deposit and had no interest in her personal history, only in whether the deposit cleared. It cleared. She signed the lease under her maiden name, Aaliyah Monroe, the name on her American passport, the name that appeared on no document connected to the Han family. Mr. O gave her 2 keys. She put one in the lining of the coat and took the subway home. Do-jun was back that evening, distracted by the Seoul meeting, and asked her nothing about her day. She told him she had visited the Nampodong market and spent too long at a bookstall. He nodded, without looking up from his phone. She went to the kitchen and began making dinner and thought about the key against her ribs and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sensation so unfamiliar, it took her several minutes to identify it. It was relief, small, careful, partial, but real. The bank account followed 2 days later. A small savings institution, 12 blocks from the Sasang apartment, the kind of place that processed overseas remittances for migrant workers and required basic documentation, but not the kind of institutional connectivity that a man with Do-jun's financial reach could trace through routine inquiry. Aaliyah deposited the equivalent of $800 American to establish the account and walked out in 11 minutes. The money came next, and the money was the complicated part. Not because she lacked access to it. She had managed the household accounts for 4 years with a level of control that Do-jun had granted her in the same spirit, a busy executive delegate's administrative functions to a reliable assistant, which is to say he had handed her the responsibility without ever genuinely examining what she was doing with it. The household budget for the penthouse ran to approximately $14,000 per month. Staff wages, utilities, entertainment expenses, social gifts, catering for the informal meetings Do-jun occasionally hosted at home. Aaliyah had been running it at roughly 68% of that number for 3 years. The difference had accrued quietly, transferred in amounts small enough to fall beneath the threshold of any review into the account she now held under her maiden name. $42,000. Built over 3 years from household savings that nobody had noticed because nobody had been paying attention. She added another $4,000 in the weeks following the Sasang lease signing. Then another 6, drawn from the entertainment budget for a private dinner she had planned, and then quietly rerouted to a simpler event at reduced cost. The hosts had been pleased. The savings had been invisible. The documents were the final stage, and Vivian had been emphatic. The documents came last, after everything else was in place, because photographing Do-jun's private files was the step most likely to go wrong in ways that couldn't be corrected afterward. Aaliyah waited. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing it for 5 years. What she had not anticipated, what disrupted the careful linear sequence of her plan, was Han Kyung-suk. Do-jun's mother called on a Thursday morning, which was unusual. Kyung-suk operated according to a social protocol that treated unannounced contact as a form of impoliteness, which meant she typically communicated through Do-jun or through her personal secretary, a woman named Mrs. Baek, who had served the Han family for 20 years and communicated with the warm efficiency of a luxury hotel concierge. A direct Thursday morning call meant something had changed in Kyung-suk's calculations. "I would like to have lunch," Kyung-suk said. Her Korean was the precise formal register of someone who had grown up speaking it as a performance of class. Friday, the restaurant at the Westin. 2 o'clock. "Of course," Aaliyah said, in Korean carefully accented, slightly hesitant on the formal endings, the way Kyung-suk expected. "I would be honored. Good a beat. Come alone." Aaliyah set the phone down and looked at the wall for a moment. Come alone meant something. Everything in their world meant something. And come alone at a Westin lunch called directly to a daughter-in-law meant that Kyung-suk was about to conduct a specific kind of business that she did not want filtered through witnesses or reported back to Do-jun. Which meant Kyung-suk was operating independently of her son on this particular matter. Which meant Aaliyah was being managed. She called Vivian at 10 the next morning, before leaving for the restaurant. "She's accelerating," Vivian said, when Aaliyah finished describing the call. "Why now?" "Because the Choi alliance is reaching a critical point. If the Inshin's situation closes the way Do-jun wants it to, the syndicate's position shifts, and a shifted syndicate changes what Kyung-suk needs from the Choi connection. She's been patient about Hairin, but patient has a timeline. She's going to ask me to leave. She's going to suggest it," Vivian said. "Politely, with money probably. She'll frame it as an opportunity. She'll be generous, and if I say no, she'll be less generous and less polite." Aaliyah looked at the clock. "What do I do? You perform uncertainty," Vivian said. "You don't say yes, and you don't say no. You make her feel like you're considering it seriously, which buys us time. Can you do that without tipping her that you already know what's coming?" Aaliyah thought about 5 years of performing exactly what was required in exactly the right register. "Yes," she said. The Westin restaurant was the kind of place where the tables were spaced far enough apart that conversations didn't carry. Kyung-suk was already seated when Aaliyah arrived 4 minutes early, which was also a message, and she looked exactly as she always looked, impeccably composed, dressed in a shade of charcoal that cost more than most people's monthly salary, hair arranged with the rigorous precision of someone who treated personal appearance as professional infrastructure. Beside her was a woman Aaliyah recognized immediately. Choi Myung-hee, Hairin's mother. So it wasn't a private conversation. It was a presentation. Aaliyah crossed the room without changing her expression, greeted both women in Korean with the appropriate degree of formality, and sat down. The menus arrived. They ordered. The service was attentive and invisible in the way expensive restaurants train their staff to be. For 12 minutes, they discussed food, weather, and a charity gala that Myung-hee had recently attended in Jeju. Then Kyung-suk set down her fork. "You've been very dedicated to Do-jun," she said. The Korean was conversational, the tone kind, the subtext surgical. "Anyone can see that. You've worked hard to understand our culture. Our expectations. I've tried, Aaliyah said. Careful. Slightly uncertain. We appreciate that, Myung-hee said. She had a softer delivery than Kyung-suk, but the same underlying structure. The politeness that functioned as packaging for something that wasn't polite at all. Adapting to a new country, a new family, it's genuinely difficult. Nobody would expect otherwise. I've been lucky to have support, Aaliyah said. Kyung-suk and Myung-hee exchanged the briefest possible look, the kind that exists just long enough to communicate everything between two women who have known each other for 30 years. We've been thinking, Kyung-suk said, about what might make your life easier. More fulfilling. Do-jun's work has become increasingly demanding. The syndicate requires his full attention, his responsibilities at home to you, to your needs as a wife. She paused precisely the right length. He sometimes doesn't manage as well as he should. He's very dedicated to his work, Aaliyah said. Exactly. Kyung-suk picked up her water glass. And you have ambitions of your own, don't you? Your education. Your interest in development work. I remember when you first joined our family, you spoke about it with such enthusiasm. It was almost impressive, the way she weaponized Aaliyah's own dreams as the instrument of her removal. I do sometimes think about it, Aaliyah said. There are wonderful programs in the United States, Myung-hee offered. Her Korean had the slight tilt of someone who had spent time in Daegu and was performing standard Seoul register. Graduate programs, professional development opportunities. A woman with your education and your capabilities. You could build something meaningful for yourself. You're suggesting I go back to America, Aaliyah said. A beat. The two women recalibrated slightly, the way people recalibrate when something they expected to be a gradual conversation has instead been named directly. We're suggesting, Kyung-suk said carefully, that there might be opportunities better suited to your genuine strengths. That remaining in a role that limits you out of loyalty, out of love might not ultimately serve you. Or Do-jun. Aaliyah looked at her plate. Let 3 seconds pass. Let her jaw tighten slightly, the way a woman's jaw tightens when she's processing something painful that she cannot immediately refuse. I would need to think about it, she said quietly. Kyung-suk's posture relaxed approximately 4%. It was enough. Of course, she said warmly. Take your time. We only want what's best for everyone. Myung-hee smiled. Her smile had the quality of a door that had just swung open and was now waiting politely for someone to walk through it. Aaliyah spent the rest of the lunch performing careful, credible uncertainty, asking practical questions, expressing concern for Do-jun's reaction, exhibiting the particular vulnerability of a woman who wanted to believe the people across the table from her were acting in good faith. She did not oversell it. She had learned years ago that the most convincing performances were the ones where the actress appeared to be working against herself. She took the subway home. In the elevator up to the penthouse, she pulled out her phone and sent Vivian a single text, confirmed. Accelerating timeline by 4 weeks. Vivian responded in 11 minutes, approved. Move to documents phase this weekend if clear window. Clear window arrived, without Aaliyah manufacturing it. Do-jun announced on Saturday morning that he needed to fly to Tokyo for 4 days, a supplier dispute that required his personal presence. His operations director, Kang Min-sek, would be coordinating the local business while he was gone. Do-jun did not appear to notice that Aaliyah's response to this news was slightly different from her usual measured acceptance. He was already thinking about Tokyo before he finished telling her about Tokyo. He left Sunday at noon. She stood at the penthouse window and watched the car until it turned the corner. Then she went to his study. The calligraphy piece behind the framed panel moved on a hinge she had located 14 months ago. A small, spring-loaded mechanism that released when you pressed the lower left corner of the frame rather than the painting itself. The safe was standard commercial grade, the kind used by mid-tier hotels and confident private individuals. The 8-digit combination took 3 attempts before she confirmed the sequence she had memorized, because her hands were steadier than she expected them to be, and she finished faster than she'd planned. Inside 3 manila envelopes, a leather-bound ledger, a USB drive, and 2 passports, Do-jun's Korean passport, and a second document she hadn't known about, which turned out to be a secondary identity in a name she didn't recognize. She photographed everything methodically. The passports, the ledger's index pages, the contents of all 3 envelopes, property deeds in Jeju and 2 in rural Gyeonggi-do, a corporate charter for a Singapore-registered subsidiary she hadn't known existed, and a handwritten agreement between Han Do-jun and Choi Byung-won dated 3 years earlier, detailing the terms of a proposed merger and the associated arrangements regarding their respective children. She read the handwritten agreement twice. It was dated 11 months before Do-jun had told her, with apparent sincerity, that he wasn't interested in expanding the syndicate's reach into the Daegu region because the risk-reward calculation didn't support it. She photographed it, put everything back in the exact configuration she had found it, closed the safe, pressed the frame back into position. The filing cabinet took 20 minutes. She worked through every folder with the concentrated attention of someone who had spent 4 years quietly learning the operational structure of an organization she was never supposed to understand. She photographed 41 documents, the ones that spoke to asset ownership, the ones that connected the legitimate subsidiaries to the syndicate's revenue, the ones bearing signatures of Korean banking officials whose names she recognized from Do-jun's social world. When she was finished, she locked the cabinet, replaced the key in the center desk drawer, and left the study in the same condition she had found it. She sent the encrypted file package to Vivian through the secure application Danielle had set up. Then she sat in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and noticed that her hand was shaking slightly. Only slightly. She put the glass down and pressed her palm flat against the table and waited for it to stop. Stopped. She began the second phase. Over the following 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, she moved her belongings out of the penthouse in a sequence so calibrated that no single day's activity would register as abnormal. On Tuesday, she took 6 boxes of books to a storage facility in the Sasang apartment's name under the pretense of decluttering. She had mentioned to the housekeeper 2 weeks earlier that she was thinking about simplifying, making space. And the housekeeper had nodded approvingly because people always approve of simplification in theory. On Wednesday, she transferred her personal documents, her American passport, her college degrees, her medical records, her grandmother's photograph, the only image of her grandmother she owned, a small framed photo that had sat on her bedside table for 5 years and that she replaced with a different, less personally significant photo that she had purchased from a Nampadong vendor specifically for this purpose. On Thursday, she moved her clothing, not all of it, not in a way that left an empty closet, but the pieces that mattered, the items she'd brought from before the marriage, the dress she'd worn to her university graduation, the specific coat her mother had given her the Christmas she turned 24. She left the expensive pieces, the things Do-jun had purchased for her, the jewelry he had given her at charity events, chosen by his assistant. She left all of it. She left the shoes she'd bought to match his preferences. She left the wardrobe that had been curated by the requirements of being Han Do-jun's wife. She took only the things that had been hers before him. On Friday morning, with Do-jun still in Tokyo, she withdrew the full legal allocation from their joint marital account, the amount Vivian had spent 3 weeks calculating, the precise figure that represented her entitlement under Korean marital property law, without triggering an immediate overdraft alert or breaching any threshold that would automatically notify Do-jun's finance team. She transferred it to the Sasang account in 2 transactions, 30 minutes apart. The total moved was significantly more than $42,000. It was, in fact, enough to be comfortable for 18 months without working, and she had every intention of working. Do-jun landed at Gimhae Airport on Saturday at 3 in the afternoon. She knew his flight schedule, 'cause she had always tracked his travel. It was one of the things she did to keep the household running smoothly. She was at the Sasang apartment when his plane touched down. She had moved everything of substance the previous afternoon, systematically and without drama, in 2 trips using the car she had legally rented under her name. The storage facility held 12 boxes. The apartment held a mattress, a folding table, 2 chairs, and a kettle. It was enough. She stood in the empty Sasang apartment for 4 minutes, looking at what little was there, and thought about whether she was afraid. She examined the question the way she examined difficult problems directly, without flinching, and the answer was no. Not afraid. Something more complex than afraid. A feeling that had no clean name. The particular, compound sensation of standing in the space between the life you are leaving and the life you are about to build, when both of them are real and neither of them is safe. Then she got in the car and drove back to the penthouse. She needed to be there when Do-jun arrived. She needed to perform one more evening, the appropriate conversation, the particular domestic theater that 5 years had made. Second nature. She needed Do-jun to go to sleep Saturday night, believing everything was exactly as he had left it. Because Sunday she was going to finish. He arrived at 4:40, tired from Tokyo, in the specific way international travel tired him. Not physically exhausted, but mentally compressed, all his attention still running through the unresolved threads of the trip. He set his bag inside the door, accepted the tea she handed him, and began telling her about the supplier's dispute with the distracted efficiency of a man debriefing himself by narrating. She listened. She asked the right questions. She noted the details that mattered. The name of the Tokyo side contact who had caused the problem, the resolution that had been reached, the follow-up meeting scheduled for 6 weeks out, and filed them precisely nowhere, because she was no longer going to be the person who remembered these things for him. After dinner, he worked in his study for 2 hours. She sat in her reading room with a book she had already finished and read the same page 4 times. At 11 he came to bed. At 12:40 he was asleep. Aaliyah lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling one final time. She ran through the sequence. The ring she had decided on the ring 3 weeks ago, the exact placement, the exact positioning in relation to the envelope. The note she had written and rewritten it 9 times, each version shorter than the last, until it was 1 sentence. 1 sentence was enough. 1 sentence was exactly enough. The divorce papers, Vivian had filed them already. The copies in the envelope were Aaliyah's set, not a threat or a declaration, simply documentation of something that had already been set in motion and could not now be stopped. She got up at 6 on Sunday morning, before Do-jun stirred. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching Busan become morning. The gradual lightening, the harbor shifting from black to gray to the particular industrial silver of a coastal city waking up. She thought about the woman who had arrived in this city 5 years ago with 2 suitcases and a marriage that she had believed was the beginning of her real life. She thought about what she had understood and what she had not understood, and which of those failures were hers and which weren't. Then she set down the cup. She took off the ring. It was a Han family piece, not chosen for her, chosen for the marriage, a thing that belonged to the institution rather than to her. She had worn it for 5 years, and it had never felt entirely like hers, which she now understood had been accurate information she had failed to correctly interpret. She set it on the kitchen table, on top of the divorce envelope, oriented so it would be the first thing visible when someone approached from the hallway. She took the handwritten note from her coat pocket and placed it beneath the envelope. 1 sentence in English, because some things refused to be said in any other language. She picked up her bag, the one that had been packed and stored and retrieved from storage at the Sasang apartment, and was now here, in the kitchen, because she had brought it up the previous evening in the bottom of a grocery bag, while Do-jun was in his study. She took one last look at the penthouse, at the view she had tried to love. At the kitchen she had used every day for 5 years to cook food for a man who had eaten it while looking at his phone. At the reading room, where she had sat in the chair by the window and thought her private thoughts in the only space that had remained entirely hers. At the life she had built from the materials available to her, which had been wealth and Iceland and the vast consuming effort of making herself tolerable to a world that had never made any equivalent effort for her. She turned. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped into the hallway and pulled it shut behind her, and the latch engaged with a sound that was very ordinary. A click, a mechanism doing its job, a door closing, and it occurred to her as she pressed the elevator button that this was how the large things happened, always, not with the sound she expected it, but with the sound of something small and functional performing its designated task. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors closed. The penthouse, behind her, held a ring, an envelope, and one sentence on a folded piece of paper that Do-jun had not read yet, but would read in approximately 4 hours, when he woke to a silence that had a different quality from the silence he was accustomed to. Not the quiet of a house where someone was moving softly in another room, but the quiet of rooms that held no one at all. The elevator reached the lobby. Aaliyah Monroe walked out of the building and did not look back, because there was nothing behind her she had not already memorized, and she was no longer in the business of looking at the past when the future was directly in front of her, concrete, waiting, and entirely her own. She turned left on the sidewalk. The morning was cold. The harbor smell was sharp and specific, salt and diesel, and the distant suggestion of fish markets opening. She pulled her coat tighter and kept walking, and the city moved around her with total indifference, which was exactly what she needed. To be a woman on a sidewalk in a city that did not know her name and did not require her to be anyone other than precisely who she was. 3 blocks away, the car was where she had left it. She got in, put the key in the ignition, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine not yet running. She looked at the street ahead, ordinary, unremarkable, saw one of 10,000 streets in this city she had learned and was now leaving, and she thought about what Vivian had said at the beginning, do nothing until you are ready to disappear completely. She started the engine. She was ready. The engine ran for 30 seconds before she put the car in gear. Not hesitation, calibration. She ran through the sequence one final time, the way a pilot runs a pre-flight check. Not because she doubted the instruments, but because the habit of verification was the only thing standing between a plan and an accident. Sang apartment, key and coat lining. Bank account confirmed active as of Friday. Vivian briefed and standing by. Danielle aware. Documents transmitted and received. She pulled out of the parking space and drove north. The Sunday morning streets were thin with traffic. She took the longer route, the one that didn't pass through the syndicate's operational neighborhoods near the harbor. Not because she believed anyone was watching at 6:53 on a Sunday, but because the discipline of avoiding unnecessary exposure was a habit she intended to keep until she was on a plane. She drove carefully, within the speed limit, hands at the correct position on the wheel. She had been driving in Korea for 11 months and had never received so much as a parking citation, which was exactly the kind of invisible competence she had been accumulating for years. The Sassing apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of old cooking and damp concrete in the stairwell. She had made peace with the smell 3 weeks ago. She took the stairs because the elevator was slow and made noise. She unlocked the door, set her bag inside, and stood in the center of the room. The mattress was pushed against the far wall. The folding table held the kettle, a mug, and a small bag of ground coffee she had brought the previous week. The 2 chairs were stacked in the corner. On the table, next to the kettle, was her secondary phone, the cash purchase, the anonymous account, and beside it was a printed list of 14 names and contact numbers in Vivian's handwriting, delivered in a sealed envelope 3 weeks earlier. The list was every contact Aaliyah might need if something went wrong in the first 72 hours. She had memorized it on the day she received it. The print copy was here because Vivian had told her to keep a physical backup of anything critical, because phones died and applications crashed, and the one moment you needed information was always the moment the technology selected to fail you. She made coffee, sat in one of the unstacked chairs by the window, looked at the street below a convenience store already open, a man walking a dog that appeared to have no interest in walking. Ordinary, unremarkable, everything she needed. Her primary phone was in her bag, powered on, because she needed to know when Do-jun found the ring. She drank the coffee and waited. He found it at 10:47. She knew because the calls started at 10:48. 3 in the first 2 minutes, rapid, controlled, the dialing pattern of a man who was not panicking, but was applying significant pressure to the situation in front of him. Then a pause of 6 minutes, which she read as him standing in the kitchen, reading the divorce papers. Then 4 more calls in quick succession. Then a text. Where are you? Not a question. A command formatted as a question. She watched the screen. Then another text, in Korean this time. Come home. We need to talk. Then a third back in English. Aaliyah. Answer me. She put the primary phone face down on the table and finished her coffee. The calls continued at intervals through the afternoon 4, then a gap, then 2 more, then a long stretch of silence that she read as him making other calls, pulling on other threads, activating the network of information that was his primary instrument for managing situations that refused to behave. She understood what he was doing. She had watched him manage crises for 5 years. He would be methodical. He would contact the building's security desk first, asking for footage. Then he would call his driver, who had not been used this weekend. Then he would work outward through the concentric circles of people who might have seen her or spoken to her. None of them would have anything useful to give him, because she had told no one, moved in fragments, small enough to leave no visible pattern, and paid for everything in cash or through the account he didn't know existed. At 2 in the afternoon, she blocked his number. The silence on the primary phone that followed had a specific quality, not the silence of someone who was absent, but the silence of someone who was present and choosing not to speak. She had been inside that particular silence many times during their marriage. It was strange to be on the other side of it. Vivian called at 3:15 on the secondary phone. He's made contact with his attorney, Vivian said. Her voice had the even, compressed quality of someone managing multiple active situations simultaneously. Standard first response. They'll be looking at the asset withdrawal first. Did you stay inside the legal allocation? Exactly inside, Aaliyah said. Not one over. Good, that's our position, and it's unassailable. The property documentation, has he given any indication he knows it's been accessed? No indication. He called 18 times this morning. Standard escalation pattern. Nothing in the content suggested he'd been in the study yet. He will be, Vivian said, within 24 hours. When he discovers the documents were photographed. He won't discover that, Aaliyah said. I was precise. A brief pause. All right, I need you focused on the next 48 hours. Stay in the apartment. Don't contact anyone connected to his world. Don't respond to his calls or messages. Do you have everything you need for 2 days? Yes, I'll contact you tomorrow evening. Vivian paused again, shorter this time. You did the hard part. The rest is paperwork. Aaliyah ended the call and set the secondary phone beside the primary. She spent the rest of Sunday in the apartment. She unpacked her bag methodically, hanging the things that needed hanging, folding the things that needed folding. She made a list of practical tasks for the coming week. Contact the graduate program to activate her deferred admission. Notify the International Development Network she had quietly joined 3 months earlier under her maiden name. Arrange internet service for the apartment. She made rice for dinner because she had a small pot and a bag of rice, and those were sufficient. She ate sitting at the folding table, looking at the wall, and it was the first meal she had eaten alone in 5 years, and it tasted like nothing particularly meaningful, which was itself a form of relief. She went to sleep at 10:30. She did not check the primary phone again before sleeping. What she did not know, what she had no mechanism for knowing, because it occurred in a room she had never been in, between people she had correctly identified as adversaries, but whose internal dynamics she had not fully mapped, was that while she was making rice in the Sasang apartment, Do-jun was sitting in his mother's house in Hyundai with Kong Min-sik across the table from him. And the conversation that was happening in that room was the conversation that would change the shape of everything she had planned. She found out 4 days later. The 48 hours after her departure passed in a sequence of small provisional victories. Vivian confirmed that Do-jun's attorney had reviewed the asset withdrawal and concluded it was legally defensible, which meant the first anticipated point of conflict had been absorbed without incident. The graduate program confirmed her reinstatement in the spring semester with a small adjustment to the application she had submitted 18 months earlier. the International Development Network, a Brussels-based organization called Meridian Bridge that connected African and Asian development initiatives, confirmed receipt of her updated profile and noted that her Korean language proficiency and cultural experience in South Korea made her a strong candidate for their Seoul office's new regional liaison position. She read that email 3 times. Then she folded the laptop closed and sat quietly for a moment, feeling the specific sensation of a future becoming concrete rather than theoretical. The shift from a plan to an actuality, which was always more disorienting than expected, even when it was what you had been working toward. On day 3, Do-jun stopped calling. The absence of his calls was louder than the calls had been. She understood this, logically. The silence meant he had moved from direct contact to strategic response, that he had people working the problem now, rather than trying to solve it personally, but the silence still had weight. 5 years of someone's voice, even a voice she had learned to decode rather than simply hear, left a frequency that didn't disappear the moment the calls stopped. She was not, she told herself, mourning the marriage. She was experiencing the neurological hangover of a habit suddenly broken. These were different things. On day 4, Vivian called at 7 in the morning instead of evening. Aaliyah was sitting at the folding table with her first coffee, working through her registration documentation for the graduate program when the secondary phone rang. The early call registered before she answered it, and the registration it produced in her body was specific and unpleasant. The recognition that early calls carried information that couldn't wait. "There's a problem," Vivian said, without preamble. Aaliyah set down the pen. "Tell me." Do-jun has retained new representation. Not his usual firm. A firm in Seoul called Park Sang-ho Associates. They specialize in high-stakes marital dissolution cases involving business assets. "I know their senior partner. She is not gentle." "That was predictable," Aaliyah said. "We planned for it." "Yes," Vivian said, "but they've filed a counterclaim we did not plan for." A pause, brief and deliberate. "They're claiming the asset withdrawal was part of a broader pattern of financial misconduct. They've petitioned the court to freeze all jointly accessible accounts pending a full audit." Aaliyah's hand tightened slightly around the phone. "On what grounds?" "They're alleging that certain documentation in Do-jun's private records was accessed and potentially transmitted to third parties without authorization. They haven't specified what documentation, which means they're either uncertain about the scope or they're waiting to see how you respond before revealing what they know." "The study, the safe, the filing cabinet." She kept her voice level. "Can they prove it?" "That depends on whether there's anything to prove. I need you to tell me exactly what you did. Not what you planned to do, what you actually did." "Every detail," Aaliyah told her. "The hinge, the combination, the sequence, the photographs, the transmission." She described the repositioning of every document, the replacement of every envelope, the angle at which she had found the ledger, and the angle at which she had returned it. She described the cabinet key and the center desk drawer, and the 3-second pause she had taken before leaving the room to verify her visual memory of how it had appeared when she entered. Vivian was silent for a long moment. Nothing was moved. Nothing was repositioned in a way he would notice. No. Then how did they find out? Aaliyah sat with that question. It landed in her chest with the particular dull weight of a question that implied something she hadn't considered, which was itself alarming. She had considered almost everything, methodically, across months of preparation, and the emergence of something unconsidered meant there was a variable she hadn't identified. "I don't know," she said. "Think," Vivian said. Not unkindly, but without any space for anything other than the required thinking. "Who knew you were preparing to leave? Who had contact with you in the weeks before you left that you didn't control completely?" "No one in his world," Aaliyah said immediately. "Vivian, you, Danielle?" "No one else." "And the apartment? The bank account? Any transaction? Any interaction with any third party that could have been observed?" She went through it. Mr. O at the Sasang building, retired civil servant. No known connections to anyone in Do-jun's world. Paid in cash, no digital footprint from her side. The bank account, small institution, migrant-oriented, no institutional connections. The car rental under her maiden name, paid in cash, returned before Do-jun arrived home from Tokyo. She stopped. The car rental. I returned a rental car, she said slowly. The Saturday morning before he arrived home. I returned it to the Centum City branch, the one near the department store. I paid cash. Did you see anyone you recognized? She searched the memory. The rental counter had been staffed by 2 young employees. There had been 3 other customers. She had not recognized any of them. She'd been careful. The car park, she said. What? The building car park. The penthouse building. When I went back Saturday afternoon, to be there when Do-jun arrived, I came up from the lobby, not from the garage, because I came by taxi. But there was a car in the visitor section of the garage that I noticed because it was still running and there was no one visible inside it. I clocked it and dismissed it. She paused. A silver Carnival. Parked at an angle that covered the exit. Silence on Vivian's end. And then, that's a surveillance position. Yes. Someone was watching the building before he came home. Vivian's voice had shifted into the register she used when a situation had become more complicated than its previous version. Not Do-jun's people. He was in transit, and his security detail travels with him. Who else would have reason to watch that building on a Saturday when Do-jun wasn't there? Asaunyat felt the answer forming before she consciously reached it, the way certain realizations assembled themselves from peripheral information she had been storing without knowing she was storing it, clicking into coherent shape with the specific unpleasantness of something that had been true for a while and was now impossible to look away from. The Choi family, not Do-jun's surveillance, the Choi family's surveillance. Of her, of the building, of the movements of a woman they had identified as the obstacle between their daughter and the alliance they had been engineering for 3 years. Myung-hee, Aaliyah said. Tell me why. Because the lunch wasn't just about suggesting I leave. That was the public move, the polite move, the move designed to give me an opportunity to comply gracefully. But if I didn't comply, if I stayed and fought the divorce from a position of strength, the Choi family loses the alliance. Hyrin doesn't get Do-jun. The merger doesn't happen. She worked through it as she spoke, because speaking was how she processed under pressure, out loud, sequence. They needed me gone. If I stayed, they had to create conditions that made staying untenable. Watching the building, watching my movements, gives them information about what I'm doing. If they know I was preparing to leave before Do-jun did, they could give that information to attorneys as a good faith offering. Positions the Choi family as loyally protecting Do-jun's interests. Which buries you, Vivian said. Which buries me. Another silence. Outside the Sasang apartment window, the street was doing its ordinary morning things. The convenience store. The man with the dog. Normal life proceeding in its normal rhythms, indifferent to the fact that inside this specific window on the 4th floor, the plan Aaliyah had built across 6 months of meticulous, careful, invisible work had just developed a crack that ran from the foundation to the roof. How bad is this? She asked. The frozen accounts are containable. We have grounds to contest the freeze, and a preliminary hearing is standard procedure. The financial misconduct allegation won't survive scrutiny if the documentation access can't be proven definitively. Vivian paused. But if the Choi family has surveillance footage of you removing items from the building, or of you making bank transactions in the days before you left, and if they transmit that footage to Do-jun's new attorneys as evidence of premeditation, then the financial misconduct narrative has visual support. And the judge will look at a woman who spent months systematically preparing to extract herself from a high-asset marriage and ask whether the asset withdrawal was entitlement or exploitation. Vivian's voice was precise and unsparing. It becomes a question of narrative. Their narrative is that you saw opportunity, positioned yourself strategically, and extracted wealth from a marriage you had already decided to leave. Narrative is that you were a wife protecting herself from a man who betrayed her and whose family wanted her removed. Both narratives have supporting evidence. In a Korean court, with Do-jun's connections and his new firm's relationships, the question of which narrative prevails is not purely about facts. Aaliyah stood up. She didn't decide to stand. She simply found herself standing, the chair pushed back, her hand on the edge of the folding table. What do I do? You do not panic, Vivian said. Panic is the response they're hoping for. Panicked woman makes contact with people she shouldn't, says things she shouldn't, makes visible moves that confirm the narrative of someone who knows she's losing. You cannot give them that. I'm not panicking, Aaliyah said. I know, Vivian said. That's why I called you this early. Because you need to hear the problem clearly before you figure out how to move. A pause. There are two things you need to do in the next 24 hours. First, you need to locate the specific point of the Choi family's surveillance, whether they used their own personnel or contracted it out, because contracted surveillance creates a paper trail we can potentially surface in discovery. Second, she stopped. Second, Aaliyah prompted. Second, we need to consider whether you have any leverage over the Choi family, specifically that we haven't used yet. Because if they're the ones feeding information to Do-jun's attorneys, the most efficient solution is not to defeat their evidence in court, to make them stop providing it. Aaliyah thought about the handwritten agreement, the one dated 3 years earlier, bearing Do-jun's signature and Choi Byung-won's signature, detailing the proposed merger and the arranged nature of the Hai-rin situation. The document that confirmed the Choi family had been engineering a predestined alliance that both families had agreed to in writing without either bride or, apparently, groom having been consulted. I might have something, she said. She told Vivian about the agreement. The details, the date, the signatures. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Aaliyah checked that the call was still connected. That document, Vivian said, finally, if authenticated, establishes that Choi Byung-won entered a written arrangement to deliver his daughter into a marriage with a man who was already married. It establishes the premeditated nature of the Hai-rin situation. And it establishes that Han Kyung-suk was complicit in that arrangement, which has implications for Do-jun's own legal position because it complicates his claim that the affair... It wasn't an affair, Aaliyah said flatly. He was maneuvered into a situation his own mother created. Legally, the distinction may not fully protect him, Vivian said, which is actually useful for us, because it gives Do-jun a reason to reconsider whose interests he's actually representing. Exactly. Vivian's voice had shifted again, the particular shift of someone who had found the load-bearing element in a complicated structure. If Do-jun realizes that the Choi family has been running their own agenda from the beginning, that they arranged the situation, surveilled his wife, and are now feeding information to his attorneys to protect their position in the divorce, he has a choice. He can continue aligned with them, or he can separate himself from them and recalibrate. He won't want to be used, Aaliyah said. This she knew with the certainty of 5 years of close observation. Do-jun could absorb almost any reversal except the discovery that he had been managed without his knowledge. It was the specific wound to his specific pride that hit the deepest. Controlled things. The revelation that he had himself been controlled by his own mother, by the Choi family, in the most intimate dimension of his life, would not produce a measured response. No, Vivian agreed. He won't. How do we get that information to him without it coming from me directly? Because anything transmitted directly from Aaliyah to Do-jun in this moment would be filtered through his attorneys as a strategic maneuver rather than received as truth. We don't send it to him, Vivian said. We send it to his attorney of record. Not the park firm, his original attorney, Co. J. Young. Co. has represented Do-jun for 12 years and has a professional obligation that exists independently of this divorce. If Co. receives authenticated documentation, suggesting his client is being used by a third party whose interests are adverse to his own, Co. has to tell him. It was the kind of move that felt simultaneously desperate and inevitable, the kind of move that worked, not because it was elegant, but because it was true, and truth sometimes had a momentum of its own. I'll need the document authenticated, Aaliyah said. The images you transmitted are already timestamped and metadata verified through our secure system, Vivian said. I can have a certification prepared by tomorrow afternoon. Aaliyah sat back down. The chair was hard and slightly uneven on the concrete floor. She looked at the wall in front of her, the one that was empty, because she hadn't put anything on it yet, hadn't decided what this apartment's walls would hold. "There's something else," she said. "Tell me." "The Choi family's surveillance. If they have footage of me removing items from the building, they'll use it. But there's something they might also have footage of." She paused, working through it. "The Silver Carnival on Saturday. If they had someone in that position long enough to observe my departure, they may also have observed Do-jun's arrival home. They may have footage of the timeline of the gap between when I left and when he returned. Which means they can show the court exactly how long the penthouse was empty before he found the ring, which supports the premeditation narrative. Unless," Aaliyah said, "we argue that the premeditation was a necessary response to a campaign of pressure that included the Westin lunch, the arrangement detailed in the signed agreement, and a pattern of conduct by the Choi family designed to force me out of the marriage by making my position untenable." She paused. "Self-preservation isn't misconduct. It's self-preservation." Vivian said nothing for 3 seconds. "Then that's a stronger frame than what we had this morning." "We need evidence of the Westin lunch," Aaliyah said. "I need to document it. Did you tell anyone about it at the time?" "I texted you, one line. Confirmed accelerating timeline by 4 weeks." "That's documentation," Vivian said. "Timestamped communication from you to your attorney, transmitted the day of the lunch, describing a response to a meeting. It establishes that something happened at that meeting, that you reported to legal counsel immediately." Another pause. "Combined with the signed agreement between Do-jun and Choi Byung-won, it builds a picture of a deliberate campaign to remove you from the marriage by any available means. And my response was legal and proportionate." "That's our argument," Vivian said. "It's a good one. But Aaliyah," her voice shifted one register lower, the one she used for things that required receiving rather than processing. "I need you to understand what happens if Do-jun doesn't recalibrate. If he stays aligned with the Choi family and the Park firm, this goes to a full hearing with both narratives in front of a judge, and we fight it on the evidence. We can win that fight, but it takes longer. It costs more, and the frozen accounts remain frozen for the duration of the proceedings, which could be 6 months. I have resources. Enough for 6 months? Enough for 12, Aaliyah said. The account he didn't know about. A brief, very specific pause. You've been more thorough than I initially understood. I've been exactly as thorough as the situation required, Aaliyah said. She ended the call at 8:40 and sat with the secondary phone in her hand and looked at nothing for a while. Her coffee had gone cold. The street below was fuller now, mid-morning traffic, people with shopping bags. A delivery truck double-parked outside the convenience store with complete municipal indifference. She thought about the Silver Carnival. She thought about Choi Myung-hee's smile at the Westin, the smile of a door open, waiting for someone to walk through it. She thought about the 3-year-old agreement, bearing 2 men's signatures, arranging the futures of their children, with the casual authority of people accustomed to treating other people's lives as negotiable instruments. She thought about Do-jun reading the note she had left on the kitchen table. 1 sentence, in English, "You can't lose what you never valued." She had written it 9 times before she wrote it correctly. The early versions had been longer, more explanatory, more intent on making him understand something. She had deleted each of them, because the impulse to make him understand was the last residue of a habit. She was done with the habit of performing her interiority for someone who had never been interested in receiving it. The final version said only what was true and left no room for response, which was the point. She made fresh coffee, drank it, made the first call on the 14-name list. A contact Vivian had included specifically for situations requiring discreet investigative assistance. A man named Kim Tae-soo, who worked as a licensed private investigator and was introduced in Vivian's notes as experienced and impervious to intimidation. She reached his assistant, left a callback number, and described what she needed: identification of the surveillance vehicle registered to Choi family-connected entities, confirmation of any contracted surveillance service operating in the Hyundai district in the past 30 days, and documentation of any communication between those surveillance services and parties associated with Park Sang-ho Associates. She did not explain why she needed it. People who operated in Vivian's network did not require explanations. At noon, something unexpected happened. Her primary phone face-up on the table now, because she had stopped dreading it, showed a text from a number she didn't recognize. Korean number, no name attached. The text contained 4 words: "We should meet." "Hi, Rin." Aaliyah read it twice. She put the phone down. Picked it up again. Read it a 3rd time, specifically looking for what she might have misread. She had not misread anything. The text was 4 words, and it was from Choi Rin, the woman whose chrysanthemum tea had been charged to suite 1407 at the Imperial Grand Hotel on the night of Do-jun's father's memorial. Aaliyah thought for a long time. Vivian had said no contact with anyone connected to his world. Rin was as deeply connected to his world as anyone except Do-jun himself. She was the Choi family's instrument, the intended replacement, the beneficiary of the arrangement that had driven the Westin lunch and the surveillance, and every subsequent complication. But she had reached out independently, on a Sunday. She should not have had access to through any channel Aaliyah had publicized, which meant she had obtained the number through her own means, independent of what her family knew. Aaliyah typed back, "Why?" The response came in 40 seconds, "Because I'm not my mother." She stared at that sentence for a long time, the way you stare at something that requires a complete reassessment of the map you've been navigating by. 4 words, and then 4 more, and the second 4 contained the specific weight of a person distinguishing themselves from the category they'd been placed, in the urgent, risky declaration of an individual refusing to be a function. Typed, "Where?" Rin sent an address, a small cafe in Gwangali, the kind of place that was public enough to be safe and unremarkable enough to avoid notice. Thursday at 11. Aaliyah put the phone down. She did not text Vivian. Not yet. She needed to think about this without anyone else's analysis superimposed on it, because the decision required her own read of a situation. Vivian didn't fully have context for the specific texture of Rin across 3 years of proximity, the quality of her silence at dinners, the way she had never once directly addressed Aaliyah at any event they had attended together. That consistent avoidance had always felt to Aaliyah less like contempt than like something more complicated, the specific social performance of someone carrying a discomfort they were not permitted to express. "I'm not my mother." It was Thursday in 4 days. She had 4 days to determine whether Choi Rin was an ally, a trap, or something in between, that she would need to navigate with the same precision she applied to everything else. Outside, the delivery truck finished its business and pulled away from the convenience store, and the street returned to its ordinary shape. The afternoon moved through its ordinary hours. Aaliyah Monroe sat at the folding table in the Sasang apartment, a room that smelled of old concrete and new beginnings, and she worked through the changed landscape of her situation with the methodical care of someone who had learned, across 5 years of living inside a world that wanted her to disappear, that the only response to a plan being broken was to build a better one. She opened her laptop. She began to write, not to Vivian, not to Danielle, to herself, a clear, sequenced accounting of everything she knew, everything she suspected, every variable she could identify, and everyone she couldn't. She had done this in her head for months, the constant low-level management of a complex situation. Now she needed it on paper, because the situation had become complex enough that memory was no longer a sufficient instrument. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she was finished, she had 6 pages of dense, organized analysis covering the Choi surveillance, the signed agreement, the frozen accounts, Rin's text, and the 4 distinct possible trajectories the next 3 weeks could take depending on which variables moved first. She printed nothing. She saved nothing to cloud storage. She read the document twice, fixed 2 factual errors, read it once more, and then selected all and deleted it. She had it memorized. She closed the laptop. She looked at the empty wall in front of her and thought about what she was going to put on it. Eventually, when this was over, and the apartment became something other than a tactical position, and started becoming a place she actually lived, She thought she might put up a map, not of Korea. A sound like green wood splitting of the continent she's going to work in, the one that had been her original intention before she followed a man to a city on the other side of the world and spent 5 years becoming someone she didn't recognize. The map could wait. First, she had to survive the next 3 weeks without making a single mistake in a situation that had just become significantly more complicated than the one she had spent 6 months carefully preparing for. She looked at the secondary phone, at the primary phone, at the empty surface of the folding table. Thursday was 4 days away, and Choi Hae-rin had said 4 words that might mean everything or nothing. And somewhere in the city, Han Do-jun was sitting with his mother's choices and his new attorneys and the specific, consuming fury of a powerful man who had found an empty apartment and a wedding ring and a sentence that told him exactly what his 5 years of distraction had cost him. And the Choi family was feeding his attorneys information from a silver Carnival parked at a surveillance angle in his own building's garage. And all of it, every thread of it, was going to converge in the next 3 weeks into something that would determine whether Aaliyah Monroe walked out of this city free or walked back into a situation where other people's power could reach her again. She was not going back. That was the one fact that remained constant, regardless of what changed around it, the single fixed point in a situation where everything else was in motion. She got up from the chair, filled the kettle, and began making tea, spliety, because the afternoon was cold and the apartment had no heater yet, and she was going to need to be warm and clear-headed for everything that was coming. And small practical actions performed carefully were the only reliable foundation for large consequential ones, which was the most important thing 5 years inside Han Do-jun's world had taught her, though she was certain he had never intended to teach her anything at all. Kettle was still warm when Thursday arrived. Aaliyah had slept 4 hours the night before. Not from anxiety, she had moved past the kind of anxiety that disrupted sleep in the first week, metabolized it into something more functional, a low-grade operational alertness that kept her sharp without keeping her awake. The 4 hours were a practical decision. She had been awake since 4:30, reviewing the 6-page document she had memorized and deleted, running it through her mind the way a musician runs scales. Not to learn it again, but to keep it clean, to make sure nothing had shifted or degraded in the 48 hours since she'd written it. She dressed carefully, not the way she had dressed. For the Weston lunch, not the performance of a woman trying to appear appropriate for a world that wanted to evaluate her. She dressed for herself. Dark trousers, a navy coat, boots with a low heel that were comfortable enough to walk in for 3 hours if necessary. Splixby. She looked in the bathroom mirror for 7 seconds, which was long enough to confirm she looked like a woman who had made her decisions and was no longer second-guessing them, and then she left the apartment. She took the subway to Gwangali, arrived 12 minutes early. Walked the block surrounding the cafe twice before entering. A sound like green wood splitting, because the habit of assessing an environment before committing to it was one she had developed without conscious intention across 5 years of attending events, where the social dynamics were always slightly more dangerous than they appeared. Cafe was small and warm and smelled of ground coffee and something baked. 4 tables occupied. None of the occupants were people she recognized. She took the table by the window sightlines to both the entrance and the service area, back to the wall, and ordered an Americano and waited. Hae-rin arrived at 11:04. She was alone. She wore a gray coat that was less expensive than anything Aaliyah had seen her in at syndicate dinners, and her hair was down instead of in the severe center part. These details registered before Aaliyah had consciously decided to register them, because her read of people had always been faster than her articulation of it. Hae-rin sat down across from her. She did not extend a hand. She did not make a social overture. She looked at Aaliyah directly and said, in English, "Thank you for coming." Her English was accented but precise. Aaliyah had not known she spoke English. She filed this under the growing category of things people had not known about the other people they assumed they understood. "You reached out," Aaliyah said. "I came, that's the extent of what I owe you." Hae-rin absorbed this without flinching, which Aaliyah noted. "I know." She ordered tea from the passing server. Not chrysanthemum roasted barley. Another small recalibration of an assumed detail. I'm going to tell you something my family doesn't know I'm telling you. Before I do, I want you to understand that I'm not doing it for you. Who are you doing it for? A pause. Myself, mostly. And possibly she stopped. Started again. Do-jun didn't know about the surveillance. The Silver Carnival. My father ordered it without telling him. My father has been running his own operation on the margins of this divorce since before you left the penthouse. Aaliyah kept her face neutral. Why are you telling me this? Because what my father is doing is going to destroy more than your divorce case. Hai-rin wrapped both hands around the barley tea the server had placed in front of her. Her hands were not steady. He's been building a file on Do-jun for 2 years. Not for the divorce. For leverage. If the merger falls through, if Do-jun refuses to align with our family permanently. My father intends to use that file to destabilize the Cheongryong syndicate from the outside. Aaliyah sat with that for 3 seconds. He's using the divorce as cover, she said. As acceleration. The divorce created proximity to Do-jun's private documents, private finances, private relationships. My father put surveillance on your building, not to support Do-jun's attorneys. He put surveillance there to find information he could use against Do-jun directly, and the decision to hand some of it to the Park firm was a secondary move to targets with one action. Hai-rin's jaw tightened. He told me last night. He told me because he wants me to be ready to move quickly if the merger collapses. He wants me positioned. Positioned how? To marry Do-jun, regardless of whether Do-jun chooses it. She said it flatly, without self-pity, which was more devastating than if she had said it any other way. My father believes that if he holds sufficient leverage over the Cheongryong syndicate, Do-jun won't have the option of refusing. The cafe was warm. Aaliyah was aware of the warmth in the specific way you became aware of physical sensation when your mind was processing something at high speed and the body registered the environment automatically, functionally, without interpretation. She looked at the woman across from her 28 years old, educated in Paris, currently describing the mechanics of her own father's plan to coerce her into a marriage she had not chosen, and thought about the 3-year-old agreement bearing 2 men's signatures. The file he's building on Do-jun, Aaliyah said. What's in it? Financial irregularities in the Cheongryong syndicate's legitimate business subsidiaries. 3 transactions from 4 years ago that connect the Singapore entity to an operation that has since been designated by the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit as a laundering concern. Those transactions were surfaced to the KFIU with supporting documentation. Do-jun's legitimate businesses face a regulatory audit that would take, at minimum, 18 months and would freeze up approximately 60% of his non-criminal revenue stream. Aaliyah was quiet. The Singapore entity, the one she had found in the safe, the corporate charter she hadn't recognized, had photographed and transmitted to Vivian without fully understanding its significance. She had flagged it as an unknown variable and moved on. It was not apparently an unknown variable. Your father has documentation of those transactions, she said. He's been collecting it for 2 years. Hai-rin looked out the window. The Gwangali waterfront was gray and cold beyond the glass. He's been waiting for the right moment to use it. Your divorce created that moment. If Do-jun is already financially destabilized by the divorce proceedings, a simultaneous regulatory threat compounds the pressure. Do-jun accepts the merger, accepts me, accepts my father's terms, or he loses his legitimate businesses to an 18-month audit. Does Do-jun know any of this? No. Hai-rin turned back from the window. That's what I'm telling you. Do-jun thinks he's managing a divorce and a business dispute. He doesn't know my father has been building a structural trap for 2 years and is about to close it. Aaliyah looked at her. Why are you telling me? Because I am not going to be the instrument of someone else's leverage. Each word was deliberate and cost something to say. I watched you at those dinners for 3 years. I watched you remember everyone's names, manage everyone's comfort, hold together situations that should have unraveled. I watched you be invisible for years, in a room full of people who should have been paying attention to you, and I thought she'd stopped. Her jaw worked briefly. I thought it was just what you chose. I thought you were content. She paused. I was wrong. You didn't question it, Aaliyah said. Not accusatory. Just factual. I was too occupied managing my own situation. Hye-rin's voice had the particular flatness of someone who had already judged herself for this and completed the process. But I'm not going to participate in my father's plan. And the only way to stop it is if Do-jun knows what's coming before my father activates it. Why can't you tell Do-jun yourself? Because anything I tell Do-jun comes through my family's filter. He'll assume I'm executing a different version of my father's strategy. He has no reason to trust me. She looked at Aaliyah directly. You he would listen to. Not because he trusts you right now. He's furious with you, I know that. But because you have no reason to warn him. A woman in the middle of divorcing a man does not typically warn him about threats to his business. The fact that you would warn him is the only thing that would make him believe it was real. The logic was clean. It was also, Aaliyah noted, a request for her to perform a significant action on Hye-rin's behalf that would require her to make contact with Do-jun when every strategic principle of her current position argued against it. You're asking me to expose myself, Aaliyah said. I'm asking you to do something that's also in your interest. Hye-rin leaned forward slightly. My father's file on the Singapore entity, if it goes to the KFIU and triggers an audit, Do-jun's financial situation collapses. Your divorce settlement depends on a viable asset pool. If 60% of his legitimate revenue is frozen for 18 months, the settlement you're entitled to becomes practically unenforceable. You get the paper victory and a number you can't collect. Aaliyah had already run this calculation. She had run it in the 30 seconds between Hye-rin saying Singapore entity and now because the financial implications were immediate and the math was straightforward. A frozen asset pool was not a defeated asset pool, but the difference between a number on a legal document and money in an account was exactly the difference between winning on paper and winning in reality. And if I warn Do-jun, Aaliyah said, he has time to take defensive action before your father moves, which protects his legitimate businesses, which protects the settlement pool. Yes, and you get what exactly? Hye-rin's hands tightened around the teacup. I get to refuse the marriage from a position where my refusal is clearly established, before my father has leverage to enforce it. If Do-jun knows my father's plan and takes defensive action, my father's leverage collapses. Without leverage, he can't compel the merger. Without the merger as a forced outcome, my refusal of the arrangement she paused. Possible. Aaliyah looked at her for a long moment. At the woman she had been looking through for 3 years, or believed she had been who had apparently been doing her own complicated navigation of a world that assigned her a function without consulting her on whether she wanted it. I need 24 hours, Aaliyah said. My father is meeting with his attorneys Friday morning. If he begins the KFIU filing Friday, I said 24 hours. Aaliyah picked up her Americano, drank the last of it. Cold now. Don't contact me again on this number. I'll reach out when I'm ready. She stood. She left money on the table for both their orders, a gesture she didn't analyze until she was back on the street in the cold Guangali air, and then she understood it had been accurate. She was not in debt to Hye-rin for this information, but she was not going to make her pay for a coffee she had drunk while delivering it. She walked 2 blocks north, stopped, pulled out the secondary phone. She called Vivian. She told her everything in 7 minutes. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was not her typical behavior, which meant the information was reorganizing things in real time even for her. When Aaliyah finished, Vivian said the Singapore entity. The transactions she described, those match anything in the documents you transmitted. The corporate charter I flagged as unknown. The entity exists. I didn't have context for the transactions. I need to look at the metadata on those photographs again. A pause filled with the sound of rapid thinking. If what she's describing is accurate, Choi Byung-won has a ready-made regulatory weapon that he can fire at 48 hours' notice, which means we have approximately less than 24 hours before his Friday meeting. Yes, Vivian's voice had moved to its compressed register, the one that contained urgency without performing it. All right, you need to make a decision and you need to make it right now, because the window for any of this to work is closing faster than our original timeline assumed. Do you contact Do-jun directly? Not directly, Aaliyah said. Through COJ Young. the original attorney. You said he has an obligation to his client that exists independently of the divorce. Yes. Then I contact CO, not to warn Do-jun personally, to transmit to CO the information Hai-rin gave me, combined with the authentication of the signed agreement, combined with the evidence of the Choi family's surveillance operation. She worked it out as she spoke, standing on a Gwangali sidewalk with the harbor wind cutting through her coat. CO takes it to Do-jun as his attorney, not as a message from me. Do-jun receives it as legal counsels advising him of a threat, not as his estranged wife doing him a favor. It protects your position, Vivian said. It's also cleaner. Aaliyah pulled the coat tighter. Because what I'm transmitting to CO is true. I'm not running a play. I'm sending documented factual information to an attorney with an obligation to act on it. That's not strategy. That's just telling the truth through the right channel. Vivian was quiet for 4 seconds. Then I'll contact CO's office within the hour. I'll need you to formally authorize me to transmit the Choi documents and the surveillance evidence on your behalf. You have it. This may not be enough, Vivian said. Do-jun may receive it and take defensive action against the Choi family without any of that changing his position toward you. I know, Aaliyah said. You're doing this for the settlement, not for him. I'm doing it because it's the right information to transmit. Aaliyah paused. The settlement is the reason the right thing and the strategically useful thing happen to be the same action. That's not a coincidence I manufactured. That's just how this worked out. Vivian made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged the distinction. I'll call you when I've reached CO. Aaliyah put the phone in her pocket and walked back toward the subway. The wind off the water was sharp and specific, the particular cold of a Korean November coastal morning. She walked into it without bending her head down, letting it hit her face directly, because she had spent 5 years learning to minimize her physical presence in cold rooms, and she was done with minimizing anything. Vivian reached CO.J. Young at 2:15 that afternoon. CO was 61 years old, had practiced law in Seoul for 34 years, and had represented the Han family across 3 generations of legal complications with the particular durability of an attorney who had made himself genuinely indispensable rather than simply useful. He received Vivian's transmission at 3:07, reviewed it for 49 minutes by Vivian's later account, and called Do-jun at 4:02. Aaliyah did not know what was said in that phone call. She never would know entirely because the only people present were Do-jun and his attorney, and neither of them owed her an account. What she knew was the downstream effects, which began arriving at 4:58 when her primary phone showed a text from a number she didn't recognize, a Seoul area code, no name. The text said Do-jun wants to meet, not his attorneys. Him, when and where is your choice? She stared at it. Called Vivian. I know, Vivian said before Aaliyah spoke. CO called me 3 minutes ago. Do-jun has terminated his relationship with the park firm. Aaliyah sat down on the edge of the mattress in the Sasang apartment. She had been standing since returning from Gwangali and had not noticed until now. He fired his divorce attorneys, effective immediately. CO is his sole legal representation going forward. CO has asked for a conversation between you and Do-jun in the next 48 hours neutral location. Attorneys present, but not leading. Vivian paused. He also asked me to transmit something to you, from Do-jun. Verbally, not in writing. Do-jun apparently insisted on that. What is it? Vivian read it in the measured cadence of someone relaying someone else's exact words. Tell her I know what the Choi family was doing. Tell her I know my mother's role in it. Tell her I am not asking for anything. I only want to sit across from her in a room where neither of us is being managed by other people and talk. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the street performed its late afternoon sounds. A motorbike, someone calling from a window, the convenience store's door opening and closing. Normal life running its normal current through the ordinary infrastructure of an ordinary neighborhood. Aaliyah looked at the empty wall across from her, the one she was going to put a map on, eventually. Set the meeting, she said. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop near Seomyeon, not the kind of carefully chosen neutral territory that legal negotiations favored. but a working cafe where the tables were too close together and the espresso machine ran constantly, and nobody in the room was likely to know or care who anyone was. Vivian was there. Seo was there, white-haired and deliberate, wearing the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in 34 years and had learned that the most honest transactions were usually the uncomfortable ones. Do-jun arrived 3 minutes late. He was a Lono driver waiting visible from the window, no operational support, hovering at the periphery. He wore a coat she didn't recognize, dark blue, and he looked like he hadn't slept consistently in 11 days, which she calculated was approximately accurate. He sat down across from her. For 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. "You warned me," he said finally. His English was careful. He used it when he wanted precision over fluency. "About the Choi family. About my mother. You didn't have to do that." "My settlement depends on a viable asset pool," Aaliyah said. "It was in my financial interest. That's not why you did it." She looked at him. At the face she had watched across a dinner table for 5 years, which was now showing her something it had not shown during those 5 years. Not the controlled, authoritative compression of a man managing his world, specific exhaustion of someone who had recently understood something about himself that he was not finished processing. "No," she said. "It's not only why I did it." Vivian put a hand briefly on Aaliyah's forearm, a signal, not pressure. A reminder that the attorneys were present, and the conversation had legal dimensions that required a framework. Seo opened a folder. "Mr. Han has reviewed the asset documentation and has instructed me to accept your attorney's proposed division as the basis for settlement negotiation. He has also instructed me to lift the account freeze unilaterally, effective yesterday." Aaliyah looked at Vivian. Vivian's expression said she already knew this. "The counterclaim of financial misconduct," Vivian said to Seo. "Withdrawn. The surveillance documentation. Mr. Han has formally Greenwood splitting, formally severed the Choi family from any involvement in these proceedings, and has notified Choi Byung-won's legal representatives that any further interference will be treated as obstruction." Seo's voice was the voice of a man who had written many of these sentences and found them no more or less significant for having written them before. Mr. Choi's regulatory file on the Singapore transactions has been countered by an independent disclosure that Mr. Han's counsel filed with the KFIU this morning as a preemptive transparency measure. The disclosure neutralizes the leverage. Do-jun had filed his own disclosure before Choi Byung-won could file a complaint. It was the kind of move that cost something, not legally, but reputationally, organizationally, in the internal economy of his world where controlled information was one of the primary instruments of power, and he had made it within 36 hours of receiving Seo's call. Aaliyah looked at Do-jun. "You disclosed the Singapore entity yourself." It was the right move. His voice was flat, not performing calm, actually calm, the specific stillness of someone who has made a decision they can't take back and has made peace with it. Choi's file was a weapon because it could be deployed without warning. If I deployed it myself, it became a liability I'd already addressed. "You lost the Singapore revenue stream." "I lost the revenue stream that was going to destroy everything else if I kept it." He looked at her directly. "I've been making those calculations wrong for a long time." Espresso machine ran a long pull. The table next to them broke into brief laughter at something on a phone. The cafe ran its ordinary current around them, indifferent and continuous. "There's something else," Do-jun said. He reached inside his coat and placed an envelope on the table. Not addressed to anyone. He slid it toward Aaliyah. "What is this?" she asked. "Additional compensation." Above the legal settlement. He kept his hand flat on the table after releasing the envelope, as though steadying something. "For the career, for the years, for what my family did in that lunch meeting." A pause. "For the 5 years of work you did that I called invisible because I wasn't looking." Vivian reached for the envelope. Aaliyah let her. Vivian opened it, read it briefly, and sat on her side of the table, without expression, which meant the number was significant enough that a reaction would have been undignified. Mr. Han, Vivian said, "This would require independent valuation of the professional opportunity costs." "Accept it or don't," Do-jun said quietly. not rudely. Simply with finality. I'm not negotiating the number. I arrived at it, and it's what I'm offering. Vivian looked at Aaliyah. Aaliyah looked at Do-jun. Why? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Seomyeon afternoon was doing its layered, complicated, city things, traffic and pedestrians, and the specific light of a Korean November afternoon. Flat and gray, and somehow still beautiful, in the way things are beautiful when they don't need your approval to exist. Because I want to make a correct accounting, he said. Not for legal purposes, not for the settlement. Because I spent 5 years with a woman who gave everything she had to a marriage I was in with half my attention, and I told myself it was enough, and it wasn't, and the least I can do. He stopped. Restarted. The least I can do is not pretend the debt doesn't exist. The cafe ran its espresso machine again. Someone's phone rang at the counter and was answered in quick, cheerful Korean. It doesn't buy forgiveness, Aaliyah said. I know. It doesn't change anything about the divorce. I know that too. Then why are you here? The question was not hostile. It was genuine. She wanted to understand, because understanding was still the mechanism she trusted more than any other. If you've accepted the settlement, if you've resolved the Choi situation, if the legal proceedings are moving, why did you ask Seo to ask Vivian to ask me to sit here in a cafe with you? Do-jun looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, his face was doing the thing it had done periodically throughout their marriage, the brief recalibration when something had surprised him. But this time it was different, because what was surprising him was not an observation she'd made about business or a practical insight she'd offered about one of his partners. What was surprising him was himself. Because I've been thinking, he said, about the night I came home from Tokyo, about standing in that kitchen and reading that sentence you left. You can't lose what you never valued. And I've been trying to figure out whether it's true. He met her eyes. Whether I didn't value you, or whether I valued you in a way that was, he paused, searching, and she watched him do it without helping, because this was his work to do, not hers. In a way that was so completely about what you did for me that I never once asked what it cost you. The table between them held their coffee cups and Vivian's folder and the envelope with the number that Aaliyah hadn't looked at yet. A waiter moved past without stopping. Those are different things, Aaliyah said. Valuing someone for what they provide and valuing someone. I know, he said it quietly. I know, Do-jun. She kept her voice even. What is it that you want from this conversation? Not from the settlement. Not from the legal proceedings. From this specific conversation in this cafe right now. What are you hoping will happen? He was quiet for a long time. The honesty of the silence. The fact that he didn't produce an immediate managed answer, but sat with the question the way it deserved to be sat with, was the most unexpected thing he had done in 5 years of her knowing him. I want you to know, he said finally, that I understand what I had. And what I did with it, I want you to know that before. He stopped again. Before what? Before I lose the right to tell you. Aaliyah looked at him across the table and felt the complicated weight of a moment that could not be simple, that refused to be resolved into either the vindication she had worked toward, or the grief she had processed, or the freedom she had claimed, because human moments involving 5 years of genuine entanglement did not resolve cleanly, and anyone who told you otherwise had not been paying attention. You haven't lost the right to tell me, she said. I'm sitting here, I'm listening. She picked up her coffee cup. But understanding what you had is not the same as having it back. And I need you to know the difference between those two things without me having to explain it. He absorbed this, the same process she had watched him apply to business intelligence across 5 years, the brief internal audit, the recalibration, the moment where the processed information settled into a new configuration. I know the difference, he said. I'm not asking for it back. A pause. I don't know if I'm even capable of being the person who deserves it back. I haven't been in this. He gestured briefly at the air between them, meaning not just the cafe, not just the conversation, but everything. I haven't been in this, honestly. I don't know if I know how. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 5 years, Aaliyah said. He flinched. Small, controlled, quickly suppressed. But she saw it. Yes, he said, I know. Vivian cleared her throat gently. If we're ready to address the remaining procedural. One more minute, Aaliyah said. Vivian settled. Aaliyah set down her coffee cup. She looked at Do-jun, the man she had followed across the world, had cooked for, and managed for, and made herself smaller for, had learned the language of, and studied the world of, and ultimately dismantled her own sense of self in service of, and she said the thing that was true without performing it. I don't hate you, she said. I want to be clear about that, because the way things ended could make it look like hate, and it isn't. What I felt for you was real for a long time. It became something else over time, and the something else became something I couldn't live inside anymore. But the original thing was real. She paused. And I think somewhere under all the things you don't know how to do, you knew that. Which is why you're here. Do-jun said nothing. His jaw was set in the specific way it's set when he was holding something with great care and not certain he was doing it correctly. But I am not, Aaliyah said, going to stay inside a situation where being known requires me to first make myself acceptable to an entirely different set of people's requirements. I did that for 5 years. I'm done. She picked up her coffee one final time. So if what you want from this conversation is my understanding, you have it. If what you want is something else, I need you to tell me clearly, so I can tell you clearly why it's not available. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not broke, not crumbled, but shifted the way a foundation shifts when the load on top of it changes, imperceptibly to an outside observer, seismically to anyone paying close attention. Your understanding, he said. That's what I wanted. That's enough. Vivian exhaled quietly. So opened his folder again. The settlement negotiation took 2 hours and 40 minutes and was, by Vivian's later assessment, the most cooperative high-asset dissolution she had conducted in 11 years of practice. Do-jun accepted every major term. He requested only 2 modifications, both minor, both reasonable, and Vivian accepted them without counter-negotiation because they were genuinely reasonable and because the practice of negotiating for the sake of it was a waste of everyone's time when the underlying positions had already been settled. By 6:30, the documents were drafted for formal execution. Do-jun signed first. He signed with the same pen he used for every significant document, a plain black ballpoint that Aaliyah recognized from 5 years of watching him work. His signature was the same as it always was. Controlled, contained, no flourish, no excess. She signed after him. Vivian gathered the documents. CO gathered his copies. They exchanged professional courtesies across the table, the efficient closure of people who had conducted a difficult transaction with appropriate care and were now complete with it. Do-jun stood, picked up his coat. He looked at Aaliyah one final time, standing beside the table in the crowded Seomyeon cafe, and for a moment he looked less like the feared head of the Shangryong syndicate and more like a man standing on the far side of a decision that had cost him exactly what it cost him and had done so with his full consent. Where will you go? He asked. It was a genuine question. Not territorial, not strategic, just genuine. Forward, she said. He nodded once. The nod of someone who recognizes an accurate answer and does not require elaboration. He turned and walked toward the door. The cafe absorbed him and then released him. The door opening, a cold vertical slice of November air, and then the door closing again, and the room continuing its ordinary business of coffee and conversation and the relentless present tense current of people living their lives. Vivian placed a hand briefly on Aaliyah's arm. It's done, she said. Aaliyah looked at the signed copies of the documents on the table. At the envelope, the additional compensation, which she had still not opened, and which she was going to open later, alone, when she could receive its contents without an audience. Not quite, she said. Vivian tilted her head. There's one more conversation I need to have, Aaliyah said. She stood, put on her coat, with Hyrin. She called Hyrin from the street outside the cafe. This afternoon had gone dark while they were inside, the November sky compressing toward evening with the efficient indifference of a season that didn't care about anyone's significant moments. Hyrin answered on the second ring. It's done, Aaliyah said. The settlement is signed. Do-jun terminated the park firm and filed the KFIU disclosure himself. Your father's leverage is gone. Silence on the line. Then he actually did it. He did. Another silence, longer, with a quality to it that Aaliyah recognized, the particular texture of someone receiving information they had hoped for and are now discovering feels different from how they expected. What did he say to you? Hyrin asked. When you met? He said he wanted to make a correct accounting. Aaliyah paused. I believe he meant it. He would. Hyrin's voice had something in it now. Not quite grief, not quite relief. Something compound. He's the kind of man who, when he finally decides to do something right, does it completely. A pause. I watched that for 3 years and always wondered why it took so long for him to direct it inward. Some people need the loss before they can see what they had, Aaliyah said. Are you going to forgive him? I already have, Aaliyah said. That happened a while ago. Forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. Yes. Hyrin was quiet for a moment. I'm going to refuse the arrangement. Formally, in writing to my father this week, before he finds new leverage to use. Good, he'll be angry. Yes, I don't. Hyrin stopped. Started again. I don't exactly know what I'm doing after that. Aaliyah looked at the street, at the Simeon evening, its particular layered density of commerce and movement, an anonymous human continuity. Neither did I, she said, when I left. I knew what I was leaving and I knew the direction I was going, and the rest of it I figured out from there. A pause. That's enough to start with. Hyrin said nothing for a moment. Then thank you. You came to me, Aaliyah said. You did the hard part. She ended the call, stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold evening air. The street moved around her people, going home, going out, going wherever they were going with the purposeful momentum of people who knew their destination. She put the phone in her pocket. Somewhere in the city, Do-jun was in a car going back to a penthouse that still held the ghost weight of 5 years of someone else's presence. Somewhere in Haeundae, Kyung-suk was in her house with the particular stillness of a woman who had engineered an outcome and watched it escape her hands at the final moment. Somewhere in Daegu, Choi Byung-won was sitting across from the news that his leverage had dissolved before he could deploy it, and that his daughter was about to refuse everything he had spent 3 years arranging. Aaliyah walked to the subway. She walked without hurrying, because she was not running toward anything or away from anything. She was simply moving forward at the pace that felt right, in the direction she had chosen. A sound with the full weight of what she'd come through, carried not as a burden, but as the specific kind of knowledge you could only earn by surviving something that had been genuinely hard. She went home to the Sasang apartment. She made rice. She made tea. She sat at the folding table and opened the envelope. She read the number once. Then she set the envelope down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at the empty wall across from her. The one that was waiting, had been waiting, would wait as long as she needed, and began to think about the map. The map went up on a Saturday. She had ordered it 2 weeks after the settlement signed, a large format political map of the African continent, the kind produced for educational institutions, with country borders in clean lines and capital cities marked by small black dots, and the ocean rendered in a particular shade of blue that was not quite the color of any real ocean, but was the color you thought of when you thought of ocean. A sound like green wood splitting. It arrived rolled in a cardboard tube, and she had stored it in the corner of the Sasang apartment for 11 years before she bought the push pins and the small level and the hammer and the 2 picture hooks. And then on a Saturday morning in December, with weak winter light coming through the window, she put it up. She stood back and looked at it. It covered most of the wall. Continent filled the space with the particular authority of something that had existed long before any of the events of the last 6 months, and would exist long after they had settled into the past where they belonged. She looked at the eastern coast, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, the coastline that was going to become familiar in ways she couldn't yet fully imagine. She looked at the southern tip, at Cape Town, which was still an abstraction, but was becoming more concrete every week. She looked at the internal lines of the continent, the borders that were sometimes historically accurate and sometimes the residue of decisions made by people in distant rooms who had never seen the land they were dividing. She thought about distant rooms where people made decisions about other people's lives. Then she went to the folding table and opened her laptop and began reading the position description for the Meridian Bridge Regional Director role, which she had now read 14 times and was going to apply for this morning. The 3 months after the settlement were not simple. She had not expected them to be simple, and she had learned to be suspicious of her own moments of expecting simplicity, because the expectation itself was usually a signal that she was avoiding something. What the 3 months were instead was dense with work and adjustment, and the particular labor of building a life from its actual components rather than from the components someone else had decided she should have. The graduate program started in January. The coursework was demanding in the way she had forgotten academic work could be demanding, not the social and diplomatic demands of managing Do-jun's world, which were consuming in a different register, but the specific intellectual demand of being required to produce original analysis in a field she cared about, to defend positions in seminars with people who were not set in her being agreeable, to be evaluated on what she actually knew rather than on how she managed the room. She was good at it. She had known she would be, not from arrogance, but from the accurate assessment of someone who had been doing graduate-level intellectual work, informally for 5 years, tracking the financial and operational dynamics of an international criminal organization whose interests spanned 4 countries while being officially invisible. The transition from informal to formal was less a matter of learning new skills than of being permitted to use the ones she had. Her professor in the development economics seminar was a Korean-American woman named Dr. Park, who had spent 12 years working in East Africa before returning to academia, and who had the specific impatience of someone who had seen too much real-world complexity to be patient with theoretical performances of complexity. She pushed hard. She expected precision. She called students on imprecise language, with the directness of someone who had learned that imprecise language about poverty and development had real consequences for real people. Aaliyah found her in the way that people find the teacher they needed when they didn't know they were looking, to be exactly the right person to be learning from at this particular moment. "You write like you're afraid to commit to an argument, Doctor," Park said, returning her second paper with a grade that was good, but not as good as it should have been. "You have the analysis. You hedge it out of existence." "I've spent a long time in environments where committing to a position was tactically risky," Aaliyah said. Dr. Park looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. "That environment is not this one." "No," Aaliyah said. "I'm working on it," she was. The paper she wrote for Dr. Park's seminar in March, an analysis of agricultural microfinance models in East Africa and their variable success rates across different community structures, was the first piece of writing she had produced in 5 years that felt fully hers. Not managed, not calibrated for a particular audience's reception, not hedged for safety. Just her thinking, clearly expressed, committed to a position she had actually reached through evidence and an argument. Dr. Park gave it an A and wrote in the margin, "Now that's a voice." "Don't lose it again." Aaliyah kept the paper. It was the first piece of writing she pinned to the wall next to the map. Danielle called every 2 weeks. Their conversations had found a new rhythm, longer than they used to be, more substantive, because they were not talking around things anymore. Danielle had been Aaliyah's first call when the receipt fell from the jacket pocket, and she had been the right call, and the accuracy of that instinct had given both of them something to build on. "How's it actually going?" Danielle asked in February. "Not the procedural, how the real one." "It's going," Aaliyah said. "Some days better than others." "Are you lonely?" Aaliyah sat with the question. She was in the habit now of sitting with questions rather than producing answers, having spent 5 years producing answers on demand for people who would have found the pause unsettling. "Sometimes," she said. "Not in the way I was lonely in the penthouse. That was a different kind, being surrounded and alone. This is just," she thought about it, "being alone while building something. That kind of lonely is different. It has direction." "That's actually a healthy distinction," Danielle said. "I have a good therapist," Aaliyah said. She had started seeing a therapist in February, a woman in Seoul who worked with expatriates and cross-cultural transitions and who did not flinch at the details of Aaliyah's particular situation, which Aaliyah had tested in the first session by describing it completely and without softening. The therapist had said, 5 years is a long time to practice erasing yourself. It's going to take real time to practice the opposite. How much time? Aaliyah had asked. More than you want. Less than you fear. In my experience, these things take exactly as long as they take, and not a day less. She had paused. The good news is that the skill is the same. You're very good at patient, systematic effort applied over time. That's actually the skill you need for this. Aaliyah had thought about the Korean vocabulary workbook, about the deliberately imperfect characters, about 11 seconds in a closet with a hotel receipt. Yes, she had said. I know. The Meridian Bridge application took her 2 weeks to complete, not because she didn't know what to write. She knew exactly what to write, but because she wrote it 7 times, each version stripping away one more layer of qualifications and hedges and strategic framings until what remained was direct and specific and true. She described the linguistic capacity she had built. She described the cultural intelligence and diplomatic experience, without naming the context in which she had developed it, because the context was not relevant and the skills were. She described the professional network connections she had developed with African development organizations during the 6 months she had been actively re-engaging with the field. She described her academic work and Dr. Park's seminar and the East Africa microfinance paper. She sent it on a Tuesday morning and did not think about it for 3 days, which was not willpower. It was the practical management of attention that she had been practicing for months, the discipline of not spending cognitive resources on outcomes she couldn't influence. Meridian Bridge called on a Thursday. The interview process took 6 weeks and involved 4 video calls across 3 time zones, a written case study, a panel interview with the organization's regional directors in Nairobi and Cape Town, and a final conversation with the organization's executive director, a Belgian-Congolese woman named Isabel, who had the focused intellectual authority of someone who had spent 30 years building things in difficult conditions and had strong opinions about who she wanted alongside her in that work. Isabel asked Aaliyah one question in the final interview that she hadn't been asked in any of the previous stages. What made you take 5 years off from this field? Aaliyah looked at the camera, at Isabel's face in the small rectangle on her screen, clear and direct and waiting with genuine patience rather than performed patience. I made a decision that I believed was about love and turned out to be about disappearance, she said. It took me 5 years to understand the difference and then to act on it. Isabel said nothing for a moment. Then, and you understand it now. Yes. How? Because I'm here, Aaliyah said. I'm not in that marriage. I'm not in that cities. I'm sitting in a small apartment in Busan, applying for a job that I should have been doing for the last 5 years, talking to you, being exactly who I am. That's how I know I understand it. Isabel nodded once. The nod of someone who has received an accurate answer and does not need to test it further. 2 weeks later, Meridian Bridge offered her the Cape Town Regional Director position. She accepted it in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, because everything essential had already been said. She told Danielle that night. Danielle made a sound that was half laugh and half something wordless and more significant than language. Cape Town, Danielle said. Cape Town. A pause. Do you know what you just did? I know what I'm about to do, Aaliyah said. What I just did is a little hard to process yet. Take your time. She did. She sat in the Sasang apartment for an hour after ending Danielle's call in the chair by the window, looking at the map. At the southern tip of the continent. At the city she was going to live in, that she had never seen, except in photographs. That was going to be the first place she had ever lived, that was entirely her own choice. Not following a man, not following a structure someone else had built, not accommodating a world that wanted her to fit a particular shape. Her choice, made with her own judgment, accepted on her own merits. She bought a plane ticket the following Monday. The last month in Busan had the texture of a controlled conclusion. Not grief exactly, but the specific quality of a chapter being finished deliberately. Each scene complete in itself. She closed out the graduate program with distinction, wrote Dr. Park a letter that was brief and specific, and which Dr. Park received with the economical warmth of someone who had meant what she said and expected that to be enough. She terminated the Sasang apartment lease with Mr. O, who seemed unsurprised that she was leaving, and wished her well with the uncomplicated sincerity of a man who had no investment in her staying, but was genuinely pleased when people did well. She took the map off the wall, rolled it, put it back in the cardboard tube. It was going to Cape Town. On the second-to-last day, Vivian called. "Everything is finalized," Vivian said. "The settlement funds cleared into your account this morning. The additional compensation as well." A pause. "It's a significant amount of money, Aaliyah." "I know. What are you going to do with it?" "Fund the work, mostly." She had been thinking about this since November. Since the evening, she had sat at the folding table and opened the envelope and read the number, and then looked at the wall where the map wasn't yet. Meridian Bridge runs on grant funding. That's always inadequate for the scope of the work. When I have the lay of the land in Cape Town, I'm going to look at where the gaps are. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You're going to use his money to fund development work in Africa." "I'm going to use my settlement, which I am legally and morally entitled to fund work I believe in," Aaliyah said. "The origin of the money is what it is. What it does from here is what I decide." "Fair," Vivian said. And then, after a pause that was brief, but carried something genuine in it, "I've handled a lot of these cases. You're the first client who has never once lost the thread of who she was in the middle of all of it." Aaliyah sat with that. "I lost it for 5 years before I got to you," she said. "No," Vivian said, "you bent it. There's a difference. The thread was always there. You just needed to pick it back up." She ended the call and looked at the bare wall where the map had been. Pushpin holes were still there, small and specific, 4 of them at the corners. She was not going to fill them before she left. She was going to leave the apartment with the pushpin holes in the wall and the folding table and the 2 chairs and the kettle that she was not taking because she was starting from scratch in Cape Town. With new equipment, new surroundings, new everything. Only the things that were hers. On the last day, she did one thing she had not planned. She took the subway to Hyundai, not to the building, not to the penthouse. She had no interest in the penthouse, which had never been hers in any meaningful sense, and which she had organized and inhabited and managed for 5 years without any of it belonging to her. What she wanted was the beach, which had belonged to her in a different way. The public, available, indifferent belonging of a city's common spaces, where she had walked alone on Sunday mornings in the early years of the marriage, before she had fully understood what the marriage was going to require of her. The Hyundai beach in March was cold and nearly empty. A few older men with small dogs. A couple walking close together. A child with a kite that wasn't flying because the wind wasn't right. The water was the gray-green of a winter ocean. Moving with the particular constancy of water that had been doing this for a very long time, was going to continue doing it for a very long time after everyone on the beach had gone wherever they were going. She walked the length of it. She was not performing a ritual or seeking closure or doing any of the things that required a story to tell afterward. She was walking on a beach she had walked before, in a city she was leaving, on a cold March morning before a flight that was going to take her to a different ocean and a different city and the rest of her life. She was simply being there, present and physical and complete, in the specific way she had been practicing being, in the moment she was actually in, rather than managing her way through it toward a safer future moment. She stopped at the far end of the beach where how the rocks began and the sand ended. She looked at the water. She thought about the hotel receipt falling from the jacket pocket. About 11 seconds in the closet, about the specific clarity of the moment she had understood that her invisibility, which had been used against her, was also the thing that would allow her to move. She thought about the folding table and the kettle and the map going up on a Saturday morning. She thought about the number in the envelope and the paper with Dr. Park's handwriting in the margin and Danielle's voice saying Cape Town like it was the most exact word she had ever used. She thought about Hyrin sitting across from her in the Guangali Cafe with unsteady hands and 4 words, I'm not my mother. She thought about Do-jun in the Simyeon Cafe, signing with a plain black ballpoint pen, his face carrying the weight of a man who had reached an accurate accounting of himself and was not finished with the reckoning. She didn't think about any of it for very long. The ocean was in front of her, and it was cold, and it didn't need her to process anything about it. It simply existed, moving, and she existed, still, and neither of them required the other to be different. She turned around and walked back along the beach toward the subway. The flight was the next morning. She arrived at Gimhae Airport at 6:15 with 2 suitcases, the same number she had arrived in Busan with 5 years earlier, though the contents were different in almost every particular, except for her grandmother's photograph and the navy coat and the dress her mother had given her, the Christmas she turned 24. The rest was new, selected, not accumulated, hers. The departures hall was doing its ordinary chaotic business of people going to different places with different seats, meaning attached to their going. She checked her bags, went through security, found the gate, sat in a row of molded plastic seats facing the window that showed the tarmac and the gray morning sky and the particular mundane reality of an airport at 6:40 in the morning. She was sitting there 20 minutes before boarding when her primary phone showed a notification. Not a call, a message, from Do-jun's number which she had unblocked in January, not for any strategic reason, but because blocking it had been a necessary phase, and that phase was over, and keeping it blocked past its useful life was a form of ongoing attention she didn't want to give. The message said, "I heard you're leaving Korea. Safe travels." She read it once. She looked out the window at the tarmac, at a ground crew vehicle moving with unhurried purpose toward a parked aircraft, at the gray sky lightening in the east by the smallest incremental degree. She typed back, "Thank you." She paused, then added, "Take care of yourself." She sent it, put the phone in her bag, looked out the window. She did not know what he would do with those 4 words, whether they would land as warmth or distance or something precisely between the two. She had not sent them as a signal or a performance or a strategic communication. She had sent them because they were true. She hoped he took care of himself. Not for her sakes, she was boarding a plane to Cape Town, and her life had moved irreversibly beyond the orbit of his choices. Simply because he was a person, flawed and complicated, and finally, at significant personal cost, moving toward honesty, and she wished him well in the neutral, genuine way that had nothing to do with love or resentment and everything to do with the simple human hope that people who are trying to be better manage to be. The boarding announcement came. She stood, picked up her bag, joined the line. Cape Town was 11 hours away with a connection in Dubai. She had a window seat on both legs, which she had requested specifically because she wanted to see the approach. She had read about Cape Town's geography, the mountain behind the city, the 2 oceans meeting at the Cape, the specific quality of the light at that latitude. She had looked at photographs. She was not someone who needed to arrive anywhere unprepared. But photographs were not the thing. The thing was the thing. 11 hours later, descending into Cape Town International, with Table Mountain emerging through the window like something the planet had built to prove a point, she understood that she had been right about that. The photographs had not been enough. The thing was much larger. Her apartment in Cape Town was in the De Waterkant neighborhood, a 2-bedroom with a small terrace that faced east, found through a relocation service Meridian Bridge used. It was furnished, which she had specified, because she needed to work before she had time to build a life from scratch, and the furniture was unremarkable in a way that made it perfectly useful. She stood in the living room on her first evening with her 2 suitcases still unopened and looked at the bare walls. She went to get the map out of the tube. She put it up that night, before unpacking anything else. She worked with the push pins and the small level and the hammer and the picture hooks she had brought, from Busan's the same ones, and she hung it in the same position it had hung, on the Sasang wall. The southern tip of the continent pointed directly at her when she stood across the room from it. She was no longer looking at a place she was going. She was in it. The Meridian Bridge Cape Town office was in a building in the city center, 7 minutes' walk from her apartment. She walked it on her first morning, taking the longer route to calibrate the streets. The city was layered in ways she had read about, but hadn't fully absorbed the particular compression of wealth and poverty and beauty and history in a geography that made everything visible. The mountain behind everything, present in every sightline, organizing the city around itself with the authority of something that had been there before the city and would outlast it. She arrived at the office at 7:50, which was 10 minutes before she had been told to arrive, and used the 10 minutes to read the organizational chart she had been sent during onboarding the structure of the regional office, the program teams, the names and roles of the 14 people she was now responsible for leading. Isabel had given her a clear directive in the final pre-start call: don't try to fix anything in the first 90 days. Learn, watch, ask more questions than you answer. Problems in this work are almost always older and more complicated than they first appear, and the people who last in it are the ones who respect that complexity before they start operating on it. It was, Aaliyah thought, advice she had been practicing for years, though in a very different context. The work was hard in the way that mattered, not the grinding, invisible hard of managing other people's comfort and other people's image and other people's world, but the heart of actual problems that required actual solutions, competing priorities, and insufficient resources, and the specific complexity of working across cultures and languages and political contexts that did not simplify cleanly for outside observers. She was good at it, not immediately perfect. She made mistakes in the first months, read situations incorrectly, moved too fast on two decisions and too slow on one, and had to correct course with the specific discomfort of someone accustomed to precision, learning the difference between her old operating environment and this one. But she learned. She asked questions Isabel had told her to ask. She listened to the 14 people on her team with the same quality of attention she had once supplied to reading syndicate business documents, systematic patient, retaining everything. By the end of the first 90 days, she understood the work. By the end of 6 months, she was operating inside it with the particular fluency of someone who had found the environment that matched her actual capacities rather than requiring her to constrain them. She called her mother on the first Sunday of every month. Her mother, who had watched her leave for Korea 5 years ago with the specific silent dread of a parent who sees something coming and cannot name it without damaging the relationship, received the news of Cape Town with a relief so profound it came out as cheerfulness. "You sound like yourself," her mother said in the third call. "I am myself," Aaliyah said. "No, I mean," her mother paused, searching for the distinction. "You sound like the person I expected you to become." Before, Aaliyah looked at the map on the wall, at the dot marking Cape Town. "I know what you mean," she said. She had not become that person simply by leaving. She had done work, the therapy, the academic re-engagement, the months in the Sasang apartment, building the practical structures of an independent life, and then the larger work of actually living it. She had processed the marriage not by pretending it was only bad. It hadn't been only bad, and pretending otherwise would have been its own form of distortion. But by looking at it clearly, what had been real in it, what had been constructed at her own expense, what she had learned from it that was genuinely useful, and what she needed to set down before it became the story she told herself about who she was. The receipt in the jacket pocket was not the whole story. It was the moment the whole story became visible. 12 months after Cape Town, she received 2 pieces of communication in the same week that she did not arrange to receive simultaneously, but which arrived together with the particular timing of things that don't believe in coincidence. The first was from Hai-Rin. They had maintained occasional contact since the Guangali Cafe infrequent, never heavy with obligation. The specific kind of correspondence that exists between two people who have been on the same side of something without intending it. Hai-Rin had formally rejected the arranged marriage in writing to her father the week after the Simian settlement. Choi Byung-won had, by Hai-Rin's account, responded with a controlled fury that lasted approximately 3 weeks before settling into cold acceptance. The practical recognition of a man who understood that leverage worked only on people who had something to lose, and Hai-Rin had decided to lose everything her father had promised in exchange for everything he had decided for her. She had spent the following year in Paris, where she had studied and where she still had connections, working in cultural programming for a Korean French Arts Foundation. The work suited her, she said, in the sparse and specific way she wrote about most things, which was entirely consistent with how she spoke. Her email in the 12th month said, "I thought you should know. I'm happy." Not the version of happy I was supposed to perform. The actual kind. I think you know the difference. I hope things in Cape Town are what they were meant to be. Aaliyah read it twice, then wrote back, "They are. I'm glad for you." The second piece of communication was from Do-jun. He had sent a package, not through attorneys, not through intermediary communication, a package, physically sent, with Korean postage, and her Cape Town address in his handwriting, which she recognized from 5 years of watching him sign documents. Inside was a book wrapped in brown paper. No card. Just the book. It was a first edition of a 1970s collection essays by a Kenyan development economist whose work Aaliyah had cited in the East Africa microfinance paper for Dr. Park's seminar, an obscure text, out of print, the kind of thing that required deliberate effort to locate. Inside the front cover, in Do-jun's handwriting, was one sentence in English. "I see you now. I'm sorry I had to lose you before I learned how." She stood at the kitchen counter in her Cape Town apartment and held the book with both hands and let herself feel the full weight of the sentence without managing her reaction to it. Because she was no longer in the business of managing her reactions for anyone else's benefit. It was a genuinely human thing to write. It was also true she believed he saw her now, believed the cost of losing her had produced in him a kind of sight that the marriage itself hadn't. She also knew, with the same clarity that had organized everything since the Tuesday she found the receipt, sex being seen by him now was not the thing she had needed. Being seen by herself, the reclamation of her own vision of her own life, was the thing that had mattered. It had happened, and the Sasong apartment, and the graduate seminar, and the Meridian Bridge interview, and on the Hyundai beach, and the approach to Cape Town International with the mountain emerging through the window. She had not needed him to see her. She had needed to stop being invisible to herself. She put the book on the shelf beside her desk, between the East Africa microfinance paper and a program report from the Meridian Bridge team's work in Mozambique. It fit there. It was a good book, and a genuine thing to send, and she was not going to perform an emotion about it that she did not feel, nor suppress one she did. She felt grateful. And she felt the particular compound of sadness and resolution that she had come to understand was not grief exactly, but the accurate emotional response to something that had been real and was now finished. Not ended badly, not ended well, but ended. Closed. She did not call him. She thought briefly about whether she would want to, in some other version of events, in some configuration of outcomes, where the damage had been less thorough and the recovery less transformative. And she decided that the question was interesting, but not useful. The version she was in was the one that existed. And in this version, she had her work and her team and her Cape Town apartment with the east-facing terrace and the map on the wall, and she was building something that was genuinely hers. And that was what had been worth building toward all along. She went to make coffee. The terrace in the morning caught the early light in the specific way east-facing terraces in that latitude caught it direct and honest, not the filtered slant of an indirect exposure, but the actual sun, arriving at the actual time the sun arrived, making no accommodations. She had taken to having her first cup out there, regardless of the weather, because the habit of being in actual conditions rather than managed ones had become one she wanted to keep. She stood on the terrace with the coffee and looked east. Somewhere past the horizon, at a distance she couldn't feel but knew was there, Busan was running its nighttime, the harbor lights, the fishermen, the street where the Sasang apartment still stood with its 4 push-pin holes in the wall, where the map had been, and the penthouse where she had cooked a man's favorite dinner and smiled and listened and understood in the kitchen afterward, with the dish towel folded over her arm. That her life had already decided something that the rest of her had not yet been told. She drank the coffee. The mountain was behind her, the city below, the ocean ahead. She was 34 years old. She had arrived in Korea at 27 with ambition and love and the specific, hopeful inexperience of someone who had not yet discovered how much of themselves a life could ask for. She was leaving none of that behind. It was still there, still part of what had made her capable of the last 2 years, still the substrate on which the rest had been built. But she was carrying it differently. 3 weeks from now, she would give the keynote address at an international economic development conference in Cape Town, her first major public address in her professional capacity as regional director, and she had been preparing it for 6 weeks, with the same systematic attention she applied to everything. The address was about the gap between development theory and implementation reality, about what was actually required from people working in the field, about the specific complexity of cross-cultural work that looked simple from the outside and wasn't. She was going to say something true in it. She had been practicing saying true things clearly, and she was getting better at it. A year from now. The first program she had redesigned in her 90-day observation period would complete its initial cycle, and she would have evidence of whether her read of its weaknesses had been accurate. She was reasonably confident it had been, but she had been wrong before, and the work required humility about that. 5 years from now, she did not know. She had stopped constructing elaborate futures and started inhabiting the actual present, which had turned out to be considerably more interesting. Coffee was finished. She went inside. She sat at the desk, opened her laptop, and returned to the keynote draft she had been working on the night before. She read the last paragraph she had written, and saw immediately that it was hedged, had gone soft at the conclusion the way she sometimes still went soft when the argument required her to commit fully to something she believed, and the old habit. Qualification reached for the sentence before she noticed it. She deleted the last paragraph. She wrote it again. She committed to the argument cleanly, without qualification, because the argument was sound, and the evidence supported it, and she was no longer in the business of making herself smaller so that the room around her would feel more comfortable. Outside, Cape Town was doing what Cape Town did in the morning. The mountain standing in its mountain way, the city moving through its complicated, layered, difficult, beautiful life. The ocean running its perpetual blue-gray current under a sky that did not ask anyone's permission to be as wide as it was. Aaliyah Monroe typed the final sentence of the paragraph. Read it once. It was right. She moved on.